I was 17 when I learned what it feels like to be thrown away like garbage. It was Christmas Eve, snow falling, Silent Night playing on the radio. My parents told me we were going on a special family trip. I believed them. I actually believed them. But I wasn't supposed to hear what my father whispered to my mother in the kitchen that night. "We'll leave her at the old gas station. Teach her a lesson about gratitude." When our car stopped in the middle of nowhere, temperature dropping to 5 below zero, my father smiled and said he needed to check the tires. That's when I knew. The engine started. The taillights disappeared into the snow. And I was alone. They left me there to die. But I didn't die. What happened next, I survived. I transformed. I built an empire they couldn't even imagine. And 13 years later, when they lost everything, when bankruptcy and shame brought them to their knees, they came crawling to my gate. The same people who abandoned me in the freezing cold now stood outside my $5 million mansion begging to be let in. And you know what I did? I looked down from my balcony at those two broken figures in the snow. I remembered that 17-year-old girl they left behind. And I gave one simple command to my estate manager: lock the gate, release the dogs. This is the true story of the night I was betrayed by my own blood and how I made them pay for it. Stay with me, because what comes next will shock you. My name is Grace Allen, and I'm 17 years old. I'm a senior at Riverside High School in rural Oregon, where I maintain a perfect 4.0 GPA while working part-time at the local library. People say I'm responsible, mature beyond my years. What they don't know is that I became that way out of necessity, not choice. When you grow up in a house where love is rationed like wartime bread, you learn quickly to be whatever keeps you safe. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of postcard-perfect snowfall that makes people believe in magic. Our small wooden house on the edge of town looked almost warm from the outside, with its string of yellow lights blinking against the white-covered roof and wreaths hanging on every window. Inside, Bing Crosby's Silent Night played softly from the old radio in the kitchen, the melody drifting through rooms that always felt colder than the thermometer suggested. I was in the living room wrapping the few modest gifts I'd bought with my library wages when I heard them. My father Caleb's voice, low and sharp, coming from the kitchen. My mother Ruth responding in that weak, wavering tone she always used around him. Something in the cadence made me freeze scissors hovering over a piece of red ribbon. "We need to teach her a lesson," my father was saying. "Make her grateful for what she has. She thinks everything is handed to her on a silver platter." I didn't breathe, didn't move. The gift in my lap, a small wooden train set from my 7-year-old brother Evan, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. "But Caleb, it's Christmas," my mother whispered. Even from the other room I could hear the tears in her voice. "She's just a girl. She's done nothing wrong." "She exists," he snapped back. "That's burden enough. Tomorrow she'll understand what it means to have nothing, to depend on the mercy of strangers. Maybe then she'll appreciate this roof over her head." I heard the sound of a duffel bag being unzipped, items being shoved inside. Bread, a flashlight, some old clothes. The pieces were there, but my 17-year-old mind couldn't assemble them into the horrible picture they formed. Surely I was misunderstanding. Surely my own parents weren't planning what it sounded like they were planning. My father had always been cold, controlling. After Grandma died 2 years ago, the only person in this house who'd ever truly loved me, he'd gotten worse. Meaner. He resented every dollar spent on my school supplies, every moment of attention I required. But this was something else entirely. My mother never fought back. Ruth had been melancholic and distant for as long as I could remember, moving through our home like a ghost, haunting rooms she no longer recognized. When she looked at me, something in her eyes always seemed broken, like she was seeing someone else, someone she'd lost. "It's decided," Caleb said with finality. "We leave tonight. The old gas station off Highway 26. We'll tell her we're going to see Christmas lights in the city. She'll believe it. She always believes what we tell her." The conversation ended. I heard my mother's soft crying quickly muffled. Then footsteps. I grabbed the scissors and ribbon, forcing my hands to move, to look busy, to look normal. My heart hammered so hard I thought they'd hear it from the other room. Moments later, my mother appeared in the doorway. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry now. She was carrying a mug of hot cocoa steam rising from the marshmallows floating on top. "I made this for you, sweetie," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. Her hands trembled as she set it down on the coffee table beside me. "It's cold tonight. This will warm you up." "Thanks, Mom." I managed my voice sounding strange and hollow to my own ears. As she turned to leave, something small and white slipped from her apron pocket and fell into the cocoa with a tiny splash. She didn't seem to notice. I waited until she was gone, then fished it out with my fingers. A business card. Waterlogged but still readable. Riverside Community Church, a place of hope and healing. An address. A phone number. I stared at it, my mind racing. Was this intentional a clue? A lifeline? Or just an accident meaningless as the snow piling up outside? "Grace," my father's voice boomed from upstairs. "Get ready. We're going to see the Christmas lights in Portland. Family trip. Be down in 10 minutes. I looked at the card in my hand, at the half-wrapped presents around me, at the cocoa cooling on the table. My little brother Evan ran past, already bundled in his winter coat, excited about the adventure. I could confront them. I could refuse to go. I could call someone, anyone. But part of me, the part that had lived 17 years hoping my parents would somehow learn to love me, that part needed to believe I'd heard wrong. That I'd misunderstood. That they wouldn't actually do what every instinct in my body was screaming they were about to do. So I put on my coat. I smiled. I pretended everything was normal. And as we drove into the darkness, snow swirling in the headlights, Christmas music playing on the radio, I knew with absolute certainty what was coming. I knew when the car stopped in the middle of the night they would leave forever. The car had been slowing for the past 5 minutes. My father's hands tight on the steering wheel as we turned off the main highway onto a road that seemed to exist more in memory than reality. The Christmas music had stopped playing an hour ago, replaced by static and the rhythmic thump of windshield wipers fighting the snow. Evan had fallen asleep in the back seat, his small body curled against the window breath fogging the glass. When we finally stopped, I looked out and saw nothing but darkness and white. A skeletal structure emerged from the blizzard, a gas station that looked like it had been abandoned since before I was born. The metal canopy over the pumps sagged under the weight of snow, and a rusted sign hanging by one chain read, "Open 24H," though clearly it hadn't been open in decades. The temperature gauge on the dashboard read -5 degrees Celsius. My father killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. "I need to check the tires," he said, his voice flat, rehearsed. He didn't look at me. "Might have picked up a nail back there. You stay put." He got out. The door slammed with a finality that made my stomach drop. Through the window, I watched him walk around to my mother's side. She got out too, moving like a sleepwalker. They stood together in the falling snow, their backs to me, heads bent close in conversation. Evan stirred but didn't wake. Then my father got back in the driver's seat. My mother slid into the passenger side. Neither of them looked back. The engine started. "Wait," I said, my voice small. "Aren't I supposed to get out, to check with you?" "Stay warm, Grace," my mother whispered, still not turning around. Was she crying? I couldn't tell. The car began to move. Reality hit me like a fist to the chest. I lunged for the door handle, yanked it, threw myself out into the snow. The cold was immediate and vicious, stealing my breath. "Dad?" "Wait!" I screamed, running after the taillights already disappearing into the white void. My feet hit a patch of black ice and went out from under me. I fell hard palms scraping against frozen asphalt winter coat, doing nothing to cushion the impact. By the time I scrambled back to my feet, the red lights were gone. Just gone. Swallowed by snow and darkness and the howling wind that sounded like the earth itself was screaming. I stood there alone in the middle of nowhere and understood with crystal clarity that this was real. My parents had left me here to die. On Christmas Eve, in sub-zero temperatures, at a gas station so remote that the nearest house was probably miles away. The wind cut through my coat like it wasn't there. My hands were already going numb. I had two choices: stand here and freeze or find shelter. I chose to survive. The gas station's main building was locked windows, dark and impenetrable, but around the side I found a door hanging loose on its hinges. The mechanic's bay. I pushed inside and was immediately grateful for walls, a roof, anything to break the wind. It smelled like motor oil and rust and abandonment, but it was shelter. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course there was no signal. I was in the middle of rural Oregon in a building that predated cell towers. Think grace. Think like you want to live. I found a stack of old newspapers in the corner, yellow and brittle with age. A metal trash can that would work as a fire pit. In a drawer of an ancient workbench, a book of matches that were probably older than me, but miraculously still dry. Within 20 minutes I had a small fire going, the flames casting dancing shadows on walls covered in faded pin-up calendars from the 1980s. The warmth was salvation. I held my frozen hands over the flames until feeling returned in painful tingles. A systematic search of the room revealed canned water on a high shelf, probably left by the last person who'd worked here. A torn road map of Oregon. A greasy blanket that I shook out and wrapped around my shoulders despite its smell. And in my coat pocket, the thermos of cocoa my mother had pressed into my hands before we left, insisting I bring it for the drive. I unscrewed the top, and that's when I saw it again. The business card floating in the now cold cocoa. I fished it out, held it close to the firelight. Riverside Community Church, a place of hope and healing. Had my mother meant for me to find this? Was this her way of trying to save me while being too weak to actually stop what was happening? Or was it just a cruel accident? A coincidence that would haunt me? I pulled my journal from my backpack. I carried it everywhere. Had filled dozens of them over the years with thoughts I couldn't speak aloud. My hands still trembled, partly from cold and partly from shock as I began to write by firelight. December 24th, Christmas Eve. They left me at an abandoned gas station off Highway 26. I heard Dad say they wanted to teach me a lesson about gratitude. Mom cried but did nothing to stop it. The temperature is -5 Celsius. I don't know if anyone will find me. If I die here, let this journal be proof of what they did. I wrote until my hand cramped, documenting everything. The conversation I'd overheard, the fake story about Christmas lights, the look on my mother's face. Every detail burned into my memory by betrayal and survival instinct. The fire crackled, the wind howled, the temperature kept dropping. I added another newspaper to the flames and pulled the blanket tighter. That's when I heard it. Through the howling wind, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. The distinct crunch and roll of tires on snow. My heart leaped. They'd come back. They'd realized their mistake and come back for me. But as the sound grew closer, I knew the truth. The engine was too deep, too powerful. Through the howling wind, I heard tires rolling on snow, but they weren't my parents. The headlights cut through the darkness like searchlights, and for one irrational moment, I considered hiding. What if it was my father coming back to finish what he'd started? What if whoever was in that truck was worse than being left alone? But the cold had seeped so deep into my bones that rational thought was becoming difficult, and some primal part of me knew that whoever was driving toward me represented my only chance at seeing tomorrow. The truck that pulled up was an old Ford navy blue beneath the coating of road salt and snow with a covered bed that suggested long-haul freight work. It stopped just outside the mechanic's bay engine, idling exhaust visible in the frigid air. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out, maybe 45 or 50, with the kind of weathered face that comes from years of outdoor work and the solid build of someone who'd spent his life loading and unloading cargo. He wore a thick canvas jacket and work boots that had seen better decades. He spotted the orange glow of my fire immediately and approached cautiously the way you might approach a wounded animal that could either flee or bite. "Hello?" he called out, voice rough but not unkind. "Anyone in there? I saw the smoke." I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up with something between relief and terror. He stepped into the doorway, and his eyes found me huddled by my makeshift fire pit, wrapped in that filthy blanket, and I watched his expression shift from curiosity to alarm to something that looked like barely controlled anger. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, and then he was moving, shrugging out of his jacket as he crossed the space between us. "You're just a kid. How long have you been out here?" He draped his coat around my shoulders over the blanket. It was warm from his body heat and smelled like coffee and diesel fuel and safety. The kindness of the gesture broke something inside me, and I started shaking, not from cold anymore, but from the sheer relief of not being alone. "Let me see your hands," he said, kneeling beside me. His own hands were calloused and careful as he examined my fingers, my ears, checking for frostbite with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew what sub-zero exposure could do to human tissue. "You're lucky. A few more hours and you'd have lost some digits. I'm Sam, by the way. Sam Porter. Can you tell me your name?" "Grace," I whispered. "Grace Allen." "Okay, Grace. Can you tell me where your parents are?" The question landed like a physical blow. I stared at the fire, at the dancing flames that were starting to die down, and said nothing. What could I possibly say? That they'd left me here on purpose, that my own father had planned my abandonment like a military operation, that my mother had cried but hadn't stopped him. Sam seemed to understand that silence. He didn't push. Instead, he pulled out his phone and my heart seized. "I need to call the police," he said gently. "Get you somewhere safe and warm. Find out what happened." "No." The word exploded out of me, and I grabbed his arm with both hands, my fingers clutching the fabric of his flannel shirt. "Please don't take me back. Please. They'll kill me again, just in a different way. You don't understand. They left me here. They wanted this to happen." Sam went very still. His eyes, which I could now see were a faded blue in the firelight, searched my face with an intensity that made me feel truly seen for the first time in years. "They left you here deliberately?" he asked, his voice quiet and dangerous. "Your own parents." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. My hand was still gripping his shirt, and I realized I was clutching something else too, the business card. It had been in my palm this whole time, the paper softened and warped from the cocoa and my own sweat. Sam's eyes dropped to it. I watched his entire face change as he read the words printed there. "Riverside Community Church," he said slowly. "That's my church. I volunteer there every Sunday. Food bank, youth outreach programs." He looked back up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "How did you get this?" "My mother," I managed. "She dropped it in my cocoa before we left. I don't know if she meant to or if it was an accident." Sam was quiet for a long moment, his thumb rubbing absently across his knuckles, the way people do when they're thinking hard about something. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I don't believe in accidents," he said. "Not like this. Not on Christmas Eve." He stood up, decision made. "I'm not taking you back to people who would do this. But I am taking you somewhere safe. There's a youth shelter associated with the church run by good people. They'll help you. And I promise you, Grace, I will come back. You won't be alone in this." He helped me to my feet, kept his jacket around my shoulders, and guided me to his truck. The cab was warm and smelled like the pine tree air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. As he put the truck in gear and we pulled away from that gas station, I looked back at the dying fire in the mechanic's bay, at the place where my old life had ended. Sam was talking, explaining where we were going, but I barely heard him. I was too busy making a promise to myself, the first of many that would shape everything that came after. If they wanted me gone, I would disappear. But not the way they intended. I would vanish from their world and build a new one, a better one where nobody could ever throw me away again. From that moment, I was no longer their daughter. The Haven House Youth Shelter sat on a quiet street 3 blocks from Riverside Community Church, a converted Victorian with blue paint peeling from the siding and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. It wasn't much to look at, but when Sam walked me through the front door that Christmas morning, it felt like entering a different world. A woman named Margaret Chen met us in the entryway, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical bun, her eyes sharp but kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. She took one look at me, still wrapped in Sam's jacket, and simply said, "Come on, sweetheart, let's get you warm and fed." The next weeks blurred together in a haze of paperwork, medical checkups, and careful questions from social workers who documented my story with clinical detachment. They contacted my parents, of course. Caleb claimed I'd run away, that they'd stopped for gas, and I'd vanished while they weren't looking. Ruth said nothing at all. The investigation went nowhere because I was 17, nearly an adult, and there was no physical evidence of abuse. Just my word against theirs, and the system was too overloaded to dig deeper into a case where the kid was already safe. I didn't care. I didn't want them prosecuted. I just wanted to be free of them. Margaret helped me re-enroll at Riverside High for the spring semester, pulling strings with the church scholarship fund to cover books and supplies. It felt strange walking into a new school mid-year, being the girl everyone whispered about, the one who'd been abandoned on Christmas Eve. But I kept my head down, focused on my classes, and let my grades speak for themselves. Math had always made sense to me in a way people never did. Numbers didn't lie or leave you in the cold. Sam kept his promise about coming back. He showed up every Saturday morning like clockwork, driving that old Ford truck with 2 coffees in the cup holder and a lesson plan in his head. The first Saturday, he taught me how to check my oil and change a tire. The second, he brought a stack of bills and receipts and walked me through basic budgeting, showing me how to track expenses in a notebook and why saving even $5 a week mattered. "Financial independence," he said, tapping the notebook with his finger, "is the difference between being trapped and being free. Remember that, Grace." By March, he was teaching me how to read contracts, how to spot predatory lending, how to negotiate for better terms on anything from a car loan to an apartment lease. Skills my father had never thought to teach me because he'd never expected me to need them. Sam filled the space Caleb had left hollow, but he did it differently. He didn't demand gratitude or obedience. He just showed up steady and reliable as sunrise and taught me how to stand on my own 2 feet. I got a job at Anderson's Bakery on 4th Street, working early morning shifts before school. Mrs. Anderson was a round woman with flour permanently dusting her apron, who asked no questions about my past and paid me fairly for honest work. I boxed pastries, wiped down tables, and learned that there was dignity in labor in earning something rather than being given it. My first paycheck felt like winning the lottery. I cashed it at the bank, took half to put in the savings account Sam had helped me open, and used the rest to buy new shoes for 2 of the younger kids at the shelter. 6-year-old twins named Marcus and Maya, who'd come in the week before with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The look on their faces when I handed them those shoes, when they realized someone had thought about them and cared enough to spend money on their comfort, that look changed something in me. My parents had tried to teach me about gratitude by taking everything away. Instead, they'd taught me about generosity by showing me what absence felt like. I would never let another person feel as disposable as I had felt in that gas station. Every night before bed, I wrote in my journal by the light of the small desk lamp in my shared room at Haven House. I documented my days, my progress, the small victories, and the moments when grief ambushed me without warning. And at the end of every entry, no matter what else I'd written, I added the same line in careful script. "One day, they'll remember my name." It became a ritual, a prayer, a promise. Grace Allen might have died in that abandoned mechanics bay, but someone new was being born in her place. Someone harder, smarter, more determined. Someone who understood that the world didn't owe you anything, but that didn't mean you couldn't take what you needed with your own 2 hands. Sam noticed the journal one Saturday. We were sitting in his truck outside the shelter going over a practice budget he'd created when he nodded at the worn notebook on the dash. "You're a writer," he observed. "I'm a survivor," I corrected. "The writing just helps me remember why." He smiled at that, a sad sort of smile that suggested he understood more than he said. "Good. Don't ever forget, Grace. People like your parents count on you forgetting. They count on you being too broken to fight back." I looked him straight in the eye, this man who'd saved my life, and asked nothing in return, and spoke the truth that was crystallizing in my chest like ice forming on a winter lake. I made a promise one day. They will have to remember my name. The nightmare started 3 weeks after I settled into Haven House, just when I thought I might be healing. The first one hit on a Tuesday night, ripping me from sleep with such violence that I woke up tangled in sheets soaked with sweat, my roommate Jessa shaking my shoulder and asking if I was okay. I couldn't answer because I was still hearing it, the sound of tires crunching over snow, that specific rhythm of rubber on ice that meant someone was leaving, driving away, abandoning you to the cold and the dark, and the certainty that you didn't matter enough to keep. After that, they came almost nightly. Sometimes it was just the sound, that relentless crunch, 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 building to a crescendo before fading into silence. Other times it was my father's laugh, not the polite chuckle he used in public, but the cold, satisfied sound he'd made when he thought no one was listening, the laugh that said he'd won and I'd lost, and that was exactly how things should be. Worst were the dreams about my mother's eyes, that empty stare she'd given me through the car window, seeing me, but not really seeing me, looking straight through to some other person, some other life, some daughter who'd died long before I was ever abandoned. I started drinking coffee at midnight to avoid sleep. My grades slipped. Mrs. Anderson noticed me zoning out at the bakery, staring at nothing while customers waited for their change. Margaret Chen finally sat me down in her office, poured 2 cups of tea from a chipped pot, and said simply, "You need help, Grace. Professional help. The kind that goes deeper than a warm bed and 3 meals a day." That's how I ended up in the church basement every Thursday evening, sitting in a circle of folding chairs with 7 other teenagers who'd been discarded by the people who were supposed to love them. The group was led by a woman named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, a therapist who volunteered her time, and had a way of looking at you that made lying feel impossible. We were supposed to share our stories, to speak our trauma out loud, so it would have less power over us in the dark. The first week I said nothing. Just listened to a boy named Jordan talk about his mother choosing her boyfriend over him, to a girl named Sienna describe waking up in foster care after her parents simply never came home. Their pain was real and raw, and I recognized it like seeing my own reflection in broken glass. The second week I managed to introduce myself. "I'm Grace. I'm 17. My parents left me at an abandoned gas station on Christmas Eve." Dr. Okonkwo nodded encouragingly. "Can you tell us what happened before that, Grace? What led to that moment?" I opened my mouth and the words lined up in my head, ready to march out in orderly fashion. I would tell them about overhearing the conversation about the duffel bag, about pretending everything was normal while knowing it wasn't. But when I got to the part about my mother handing me the cocoa, about her trembling hands and averted eyes, something in my throat closed up tight as a fist. I sat there with my mouth open and nothing coming out, feeling 7 pairs of eyes on me, feeling the memory of that thermos warm against my palms, and the way steam had risen from the marshmallows while my mother refused to look at me. "It's okay," Dr. Okonkwo said softly. "You don't have to tell it all at once." But I did have to, didn't I? That was the whole point of being here. Except every time I tried over the following weeks, I got to that same moment and stopped. The hot cocoa moment, I started calling it in my head. The last act of something that might have been love, or might have been guilt, or might have been nothing at all except habit and muscle memory and the performance of maternal care. Sam found me crying in his truck one Saturday after I'd spent the previous night awake, afraid to sleep, afraid to dream. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just handed me a clean handkerchief from his glove compartment and waited while I pulled myself together. "I can't stop seeing it," I finally said, my voice hoarse. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there. And in the therapy group, I can't even talk about it. I get to this one part, and I just freeze. Sam was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd lived through his own set of nightmares. "Grace, I'm going to tell you something that took me 20 years to learn. You don't need to forget it. You don't need to talk about it until you're ready. You just need to use it to move forward." He turned to look at me, then his faded blue eyes serious. "That night, that betrayal. It's part of you now. It's in your bones. You can let it poison you, or you can let it make you stronger. Your choice." Something about the way he said it with no false comfort or empty promises steadied me. He wasn't telling me the pain would go away. He was telling me I could carry it and still walk forward. There was a kind of brutal honesty in that I found more comforting than any amount of sympathy. I started writing again that night, but differently this time. Instead of just documenting my days, I began writing letters. Thank you letters to Margaret Chen for taking me in, to Mrs. Anderson for giving me a job without judgment, to Dr. Okonkwo for her patience, to Sam for showing up week after week and teaching me that not all men abandon the people who need them. I wrote to the church scholarship fund, to the anonymous donors who'd paid for my books, to the nurse who'd checked me for frostbite that first night and been gentle about it. I didn't mail most of them right away. I just kept them in a folder, these small acknowledgments of goodness, proof that not everyone in the world was cruel. On the bad nights when the nightmares came, and I woke up gasping, I would pull out that folder and read through them, reminding myself that I'd found people worth thanking, that I was building something new. The nightmares didn't stop, but I learned to breathe through them. I learned to get up, splash cold water on my face, and write another entry in my journal, ending with those same words, "One day they'll remember my name." I was healing slowly in the way broken bones heal, with invisible mending that left you stronger in the fractured places. I thought I had time to finish that healing before facing them again. I thought I could build my new life in peace, far from their shadows. But I didn't know my past would find me sooner than I expected. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, 6 months after the gas station. I was wiping down tables at Anderson's Bakery during the quiet period between lunch rush and dinner prep, my mind on the calculus homework waiting in my backpack, when Mrs. Anderson turned on the small television mounted in the corner. She liked having the local news playing, said it made the place feel more homey, though I suspected she just enjoyed the company of voices when business was slow. I was scrubbing at a particularly stubborn coffee ring when I heard the sports anchor's enthusiastic voice cut through my concentration. And in high school, baseball news, Riverside's own Evan Allen is making waves as one of the most promising young pitchers in the state. The freshman phenom has scouts already taking notice. My hand stopped mid-wipe. The rag went still against the table. I looked up at the screen, and there he was. My little brother. Except he wasn't little anymore. At 14, Evan had grown tall and lean, his face losing its childhood softness, his movements on the pitcher's mound confident and powerful. He wore a crisp white uniform with blue pinstripes, the kind that cost more than my entire month's wages, and when he smiled for the camera, it was the easy smile of someone who'd never doubted he was loved. The camera cut to an interview setup, and my breath caught in my throat. My parents sat on a bench near the baseball diamond spring sunshine, making them look wholesome and all-American. My mother wore a pale yellow cardigan I'd never seen before, her hair styled in a way that made her look softer, younger. My father had his arm around her shoulders in a gesture of protective intimacy that would have been laughable if it hadn't made me want to put my fist through the screen. "Mr. and Mrs. Allen, your son is quite the talent," the interviewer said, a perky blonde woman with a microphone bearing the local news station's logo. "You must be so proud." "We are," my father said, and his voice carried that particular tone of humble pride he'd always been able to manufacture on demand. "Evan's worked very hard for this. We've tried to give him every opportunity to succeed." "Family is everything to us," my mother added, and I watched her mouth form those words, watched her eyes glisten with what the camera would read as emotion. But I knew those eyes. I'd stared into them through a car window while she drove away. They were as dry now as they'd been then, the moisture purely for performance. The interviewer's expression shifted to something more somber. "I understand your family has faced tragedy. Can you tell us about that?" My mother's hand went to her throat in a gesture of delicate distress. "Our eldest daughter, Grace, went missing several years ago. It's been very difficult. We still hold out hope that she'll come home someday." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired the craftsmanship of it. Went missing. As if I'd wandered away like a lost puppy. As if they hadn't orchestrated my disappearance with the precision of a military operation. "That must be incredibly painful," the interviewer said, her voice dripping with sympathy. "How do you cope?" "We focus on Evan," my father said, squeezing my mother's shoulder. "We make sure he knows how loved he is. That's what Grace would have wanted." The screen cut back to footage of Evan pitching his form perfect, his future bright and shining. The segment ended with information about the team's championship prospects and upcoming games. Mrs. Anderson sighed and said something about what a nice family they seemed to be. Such a shame about their missing daughter, and I realized I was still standing there, frozen rag in hand, staring at a screen that had moved on to a commercial for lawn fertilizer. I looked down at myself, at the faded jeans I'd bought from the Goodwill for $3, at the bakery apron with someone else's name embroidered on it because Mrs. Anderson couldn't afford new ones, at the borrowed winter coat hanging by the door because mine had been lost somewhere in the chaos of that night, and I hadn't been able to replace it yet. I was surviving on minimum wage and charity, living in a shelter, working myself to exhaustion to save money for a future that felt impossibly far away. And they were there, wealthy, pitied, respected, playing the role of grieving parents while their son pitched his way to a scholarship and a life I'd never be allowed to have. They'd thrown me away and somehow managed to profit from my absence to use my disappearance as another thread in the narrative of their martyrdom. Something cold and clear crystallized in my chest, sharp as ice and just as unforgiving. I'd spent 6 months trying to heal, trying to move forward, trying to be grateful for the second chance I'd been given. But gratitude wasn't going to change the fact that they'd won. They'd gotten rid of the daughter they didn't want, and still got to play the role of devastated parents for the cameras. They'd attempted murder by exposure and received sympathy in return. Mrs. Anderson was talking about poor Evan growing up without his sister, such a burden for a young man to carry. I made appropriate noises of agreement while something fundamental shifted inside me. The girl who'd wanted to forget, who'd tried to build a new life separate from her past, was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that survival wasn't enough, that living well wasn't just the best revenge, it was the only revenge that mattered. I didn't cry. I'd stopped crying for them months ago. Instead, I felt my mouth curve into something that might have looked like a smile to anyone who didn't know better. Mrs. Anderson was still talking, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. I set down the rag, untied my apron with careful, deliberate movements, and spoke so quietly that only I could hear it. "If they want the world to think I'm dead, I'll live more brilliantly than ever." The words felt like a vow, like the promises I wrote in my journal, but sharper, more focused. They'd tried to erase me. Instead, they'd created someone who would make sure they never forgot my name. Someone who would rise so high and shine so bright that their comfortable lie would become impossible to maintain. I picked up my rag and went back to cleaning tables. But everything had changed. The homework in my backpack wasn't just schoolwork anymore. It was ammunition. The money in my savings account wasn't just security, it was fuel. Every skill Sam taught me, every lesson learned, every small victory, they were all building blocks for something larger. If they wanted me dead, I'd show them what it means to truly live. The letter arrived in early November of my senior year, printed on heavy cream-colored paper that felt expensive between my fingers. Portland State University. Full academic scholarship. Finance program. I read it 3 times in the Haven House common room before the words fully registered, before I could believe that someone had looked at my transcripts and test scores and decided I was worth investing in, despite having no permanent address and a family history that read like a cautionary tale. Margaret Chen found me sitting there with the letter clutched in both hands, tears streaming down my face for the first time since I'd watched my parents on television. She sat down beside me without a word and waited until I could speak. "They're giving me a full ride," I managed. "Tuition, books, room and board. Everything." "Of course they are," Margaret said matter-of-factly. "Your GPA is 4.0 and your entrance essay was exceptional. You earned this grace. Don't forget that." But earning it and believing I deserved it were 2 different things, and it took Sam's visit that Saturday to bridge the gap. He brought coffee as always, and when I showed him the letter, his weathered face broke into the widest smile I'd ever seen on him. "Finance," he said, running his thumb over the university seal embossed at the top of the page. "That's smart. Real smart. You're going to learn how the world actually works, not how people pretend it works." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a silver bracelet, simple and elegant, with a single word engraved on the inside of the band, where it would rest against my skin. "Survive." "I had this made for you," Sam said, his voice gruff with emotion he was trying to hide. "Figured you could use a reminder of how far you've come. Keep it close, Grace. When things get hard at that university, and they will get hard, you remember that you've already survived worse than anything a professor can throw at you." I slipped the bracelet into my pocket rather than wearing it, needing to feel its weight there, solid and real, a talisman against doubt. It became my ritual to touch it before exams, before presentations, before any moment when I needed to remember who I'd become. Portland State in January was a universe away from the shelter and the bakery and the small radius of my previous life. Professor Margaret Wu taught my introductory finance course, and she was nothing like I'd expected. Where I'd imagined someone stuffy and detached, I found a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes behind designer glasses and a way of speaking that cut through nonsense, like a knife through silk. She pulled me aside after the second week of class, gestured to her office, and closed the door behind us. "I read your entrance essay," she said without preamble. "The one about financial literacy as a tool for escaping generational poverty. It was rawer than most students would dare to write." I said nothing, unsure where this was going. "You've experienced real hardship," Professor Wu continued. "I can see it in how you take notes, like you're afraid the knowledge will disappear if you don't capture every word. That desperation will serve you well if you channel it correctly." She leaned forward, elbows on her desk. "But here's what I need you to understand. Don't let pain control you. Use it as investment capital. Take that hurt, that anger, that fear, and invest it in building something they can never take away from you." The words hit me like a physical force. Investment capital. She was giving me permission to weaponize my trauma, to transform it from a burden into a tool. It was exactly what I'd been trying to articulate to myself since seeing my parents on television, but hearing it from someone who'd built a successful career, who commanded respect in rooms full of powerful people, made it feel possible rather than just desperately hoped for. I threw myself into the work with an intensity that made my classmates nervous. While they treated assignments as boxes to check, I treated them as skills to master. Professor Wu's office hours became my second home. She taught me how to read financial statements the way detectives read crime scenes, looking for inconsistencies and hidden motives. She introduced me to the Campus Investment Club, where students managed a small portfolio of real money donated by alumni. My first investment was modest $300 of my bakery savings into a stable dividend stock Professor Wu recommended. I watched it obsessively, learning how markets moved, how fear and greed drove human behavior in predictable patterns, how information was currency and timing was everything. When it gained 12% over 3 months, I didn't celebrate. I reinvested the profit and studied what I'd done right so I could replicate it. The other club members were mostly business majors from comfortable families who treated the portfolio like a game. They'd never had to choose between textbooks and food. They'd never understood that money wasn't just about wealth, it was about safety, about control, about making sure nobody could ever abandon you again because you'd built a fortress of financial independence they couldn't breach. I learned about contracts and leverage, about hostile takeovers and golden parachutes, about all the ways corporations and wealthy individuals protected themselves from consequences. I learned that justice and law were two different things, and that the person with the better lawyers and the deeper pockets almost always won. Most importantly, I learned that money was power, and power was the only language certain people understood. Sam noticed the change in me when I came home for spring break. We sat in his truck outside Haven House, and he studied my face with those faded blue eyes that never missed much. "You're different," he observed. "Harder." "Stronger," I corrected. "There's a difference between strong and cold grace. Don't lose yourself in whatever you're building." I touched the bracelet in my pocket, felt the engraved word against my fingertips. Survive. That's what I was doing. That's all I'd ever been doing. But survival had evolved from simply breathing to something more complex, more calculated. I began learning how to turn money into a tool for repaying my soul's debt. David Brennan sat 2 rows ahead of me in advanced corporate finance, and for the first 3 weeks of my sophomore year, I knew him only as the guy who asked intelligent questions and had a habit of tapping his pen against his notebook when he was thinking. He had sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead when he leaned over his work, and a laugh that sounded genuinely surprised when Professor Wu made one of her rare jokes about market volatility. We officially met in the library during midterm season, both of us reaching for the same reference book on merger arbitrage at 2 a.m. He pulled his hand back with an apologetic smile. "You take it," he said. "I've been staring at balance sheets for 6 hours straight. Pretty sure my brain stopped processing information around midnight. Mine gave up around 10. I admitted, surprised to find myself smiling back. "But I need this for a case study due tomorrow." "Fair enough." He grabbed his coffee cup from the nearby table. "I'm David, by the way. I've seen you in Wu's class. You're the one who corrected her calculation on that Deutsche Bank analysis." "She wasn't wrong," I said quickly. "She was testing whether anyone was paying attention." "And you were." He studied me with open curiosity, no judgment in it. "Grace Wright. Grace Allen." The sound of my real name, the one I'd kept despite everything, made something inside me go still. But David just stood there with his coffee and his tired eyes and his easy manner that suggested he had no hidden agendas, no ulterior motives, just a fellow finance student burning the midnight oil. We started studying together after that. It began innocently enough, comparing notes, quizzing each other before exams, grabbing coffee between classes. David was from a middle-class family in Eugene, his father a high school teacher and his mother a nurse. He worked 2 part-time jobs to supplement his partial scholarship and understood what it meant to count every dollar. Unlike most of our classmates, he didn't come from money, didn't have family connections waiting to hand him a job after graduation. He was earning his place the same way I was, through relentless work and refusing to quit. By winter break of that year, studying had evolved into long conversations about everything beyond finance. He told me about growing up with 3 younger sisters, about his father's quiet dignity, teaching algebra to teenagers who didn't want to learn, about his dream of starting a consulting firm that helped small businesses survive instead of getting swallowed by corporations. I found myself telling him things I'd never told anyone except Sam, about my dreams of financial independence, about wanting to build something that could never be taken away, about believing that understanding money was understanding power. I didn't tell him about the gas station, about my parents, about the core wound that drove everything I did. But I told him enough that he should have seen the walls I'd built, the fortress I lived inside. Instead, he just listened with those patient eyes and made me feel like maybe I didn't have to defend every inch of ground, at least not with him. We fell in love the way students do, in stolen hours between classes and late-night study sessions that turned into talking until dawn. David kissed me for the first time in the library stacks, surrounded by books on economic theory. And for the first time since that Christmas Eve, I believed someone could see me, really see me, and choose to stay. He met Sam one weekend when the older man drove up to take me to lunch. I watched them size each other up. Two men who loved me in different ways and felt something like hope when Sam later told me David seemed like good people. "He looks at you like you're worth something," Sam said. "Don't settle for less than that." I didn't plan to. For 6 months, David was my proof that not everyone left that love didn't have to be conditional or transactional. We studied together, dreamed together, and he held my hand through panic attacks I finally admitted to having. He never pushed for explanations I wasn't ready to give. He just held space for all the broken parts of me and treated them like they were worth the patience. The wedding announcement arrived on a Tuesday in April, cream-colored cardstock in an expensive envelope. Mr. and Mrs. Harold Westbrook cordially invite you to the marriage of their daughter Catherine Ann to Mr. David Michael Brennan. I stared at it in my campus mailbox, the words refusing to make sense. We'd talked the night before. He'd kissed me goodbye after our study session, told me he'd see me Thursday in Wu's class, acted like everything was exactly as it had always been. I called him. It went to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. On the third try, he picked up. "Grace," he said, and his voice was hollow. "I'm sorry. I was going to tell you." "Tell me what? That you're engaged? That you've been lying to me?" My hand shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. "My father's business is drowning in debt," he said quietly. "Medical bills from my mom's cancer treatment. They're going to lose everything. Catherine's father owns the bank that holds their loans. He offered to forgive them if I married her. I didn't have a choice." "Everyone has a choice," I said, and my voice sounded strange even to my own ears, distant and cold. "You're just choosing them over me. Over us. I'm choosing my family's survival. Grace, please try to understand." But I did understand. That was the worst part. I understood perfectly that when push came to shove, love lost to security every single time. That people made calculations about who mattered and who was expendable, and I'd been judged expendable again. David was just doing what my parents had done, choosing the practical option, protecting the people he deemed most important. I just wasn't one of them. "I hope you'll be very happy," I said, and hung up before he could hear my voice break. I didn't cry. I didn't call him back. I didn't rage or beg or try to change his mind. Instead, I bought a cream-colored envelope to match his wedding invitation, addressed it in my careful handwriting, and enclosed a single sheet of paper with one line written in black ink. "Congratulations. You chose safety over soul." I mailed it the next day and then threw myself back into Professor Wu's assignments with renewed intensity. The other students probably thought I was obsessive the way I attacked every problem set, every case study like it was personal. They weren't entirely wrong. Every formula I mastered, every concept I conquered, it was armor. Protection against ever being vulnerable enough to believe that love could be anything more than another form of transaction. Sam came up the following weekend without being asked, somehow knowing I needed him. We sat in his truck and he let me be silent until I was ready to talk. "He left," I finally said. "For money and security, just like everyone else." "People are afraid," Sam said quietly. "Fear makes them do terrible things to the people who trust them." I touched the bracelet in my pocket, felt the word engraved there. Survive. That's what I'd do. I'd survive this too. I learned love is just another investment, and I'd taken a heavy loss. The rain started an hour before the graduation ceremony ended, a spring downpour that turned the campus quad into a maze of puddles reflecting the streetlights in fractured gold. I stood alone under one of those lights, cap and gown plastered to my body diploma, protected inside a plastic sleeve I'd bought specifically for this moment. Around me, families clustered in excited groups, cameras flashing, parents embracing their graduates with pride that felt like a language I'd never quite learned to speak. My roommate Jessa had invited me to join her family's celebration dinner, but I'd declined with a smile that felt like it might crack my face. This moment belonged to me alone. 4 years of relentless work of studying until my eyes burned and my hands cramped of choosing textbooks over meals and knowledge over sleep. I'd graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance and a job offer from a mid-sized investment firm in Portland. I'd done everything right, checked every box, exceeded every expectation. So why did victory taste like ashes in my mouth? I heard the truck before I saw it, that familiar rumble of Sam's old Ford cutting through the sound of rain on pavement. He pulled up to the curb and leaned across to push open the passenger door, and something inside my chest that had been held rigid for 4 years suddenly loosened. "Get in before you drown," he called, and I climbed into the warm cab that smelled like coffee and diesel and safety. Sam looked older than he had when he'd found me at that gas station. Gray had overtaken most of his hair, and new lines creased his face, but his eyes were the same steady blue that had seen me through the worst nights of my life. He handed me a towel from behind the seat and waited while I dried my face and hair. "Congratulations, college graduate," he said, and there was such genuine pride in his voice that I had to look away. "You're the only one who came," I said quietly. "I'm the only one who matters." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small velvet pouch I recognized immediately. "I've been holding on to this, waiting for the right moment." The silver bracelet gleamed in the dim light of the truck cab, that single word engraved on the inside catching my eye. Survive. I'd carried it in my pocket for 4 years, touching it before exams and presentations, but I'd never worn it. Wearing it felt too much like declaring victory when I was still fighting battles. "I think it's time you actually put this on," Sam said, taking my wrist gently and fastening the clasp. The metal was cool against my skin, the weight of it both familiar and strange. "You've gone further than I ever imagined, Grace. Than you probably imagined when I found you half frozen in that gas station." I survived. I said the word feeling inadequate for everything it had taken to get here. "You did more than survive. You built yourself from nothing. You earned this degree with no family support, no safety net, nothing but your own determination." He paused, studying my face in the streetlight. "But I see something in your eyes that worries me. That anger you've been feeding for 4 years, it's getting bigger, meaner." I thought about my parents accepting sympathy for their missing daughter while I worked 3 jobs to pay for textbooks. About David choosing security over love, proving that everyone had a price at which they'd betray you. About every person who'd looked at me and seen something disposable, forgettable beneath consideration. "They think I'm dead or broken or too weak to matter." I said, my voice steady, despite the storm inside me. "Every single person who threw me away, who used me, who decided I wasn't worth keeping. They're all living their comfortable lives thinking they won. And you want them to know they were wrong. I want more than that." I looked at Sam, this man who'd saved my life, and asked nothing in return, and spoke the truth I'd been circling for months. I want to become someone they can never touch. Someone so far above their reach that they'll spend the rest of their lives knowing they threw away something they could never afford to lose. Sam was quiet for a long moment, rain drumming on the truck roof, the heater humming between us. "Revenge is a poison, Grace. I've seen it eat people alive from the inside." "This isn't revenge," I said, though we both knew I was lying. "This is justice. This is making sure no one ever has the power to leave me in the cold again." He sighed, a sound full of resignation and understanding, and the kind of love that doesn't require agreement to exist. "What are you going to do?" I touched the bracelet on my wrist, felt its presence like a promise being fulfilled. "I'm going to disappear. Grace Allen, the girl they abandoned, the daughter who went missing, the girlfriend who wasn't worth fighting for, she's going to cease to exist, and someone new is going to rise in her place. That's a dangerous game. Living was dangerous. This is just choosing who gets to make the rules." Sam drove me back to my apartment, one of those tiny studios near campus that I'd rented with my job savings. After he left, I sat at my desk with a fresh notebook and began writing. Not in my journal with its emotional purging and daily documentation, but with cold, calculated precision. A plan. I would need a new identity legally obtained through the proper channels. California had better privacy laws for name changes, especially for domestic abuse survivors. I would move, establish residency, file the paperwork. Grace Allen would become someone else, someone with no history trailing behind her like chains. I would take the job in Portland but use it as a stepping stone, learning everything I could about how money moved through the world, who controlled it, where the real power lived. I would build wealth slowly and carefully, making investments that compounded over time, creating a fortress of financial independence. And someday, when I was ready, when I was untouchable, I would walk back into their lives and show them exactly what they'd tried to destroy. The rain kept falling as I wrote, my handwriting neat and controlled, each step mapped out with the same precision I'd applied to every finance problem I'd ever solved. The bracelet caught the light from my desk lamp, that single word glinting. Survive. I'd done that. Now it was time for the next phase. And to do that, I had to die, at least on paper. The accident happened 3 weeks after graduation on a stretch of Highway 26, notorious for curves and poor visibility in bad weather. I chose the location carefully, a spot where the shoulder widened enough to pull off safely but looked treacherous in the rain. I chose a Wednesday evening when traffic was light but steady enough that someone would find my car within hours. I chose every detail the way Professor Wu had taught me, to analyze risk-calculating variables and outcomes until I was certain of the result. I drove my 10-year-old Honda to the spot just as dusk settled and rain began to fall in sheets. The car had served me well through college, reliable if unremarkable, and I felt a strange pang leaving it behind. I positioned it at an angle that suggested I'd pulled over suddenly, perhaps for an emergency. Left the driver's door slightly ajar. Scattered my belongings across the front seat with calculated randomness, my wallet with Grace Allen's driver's license prominently visible, a textbook from last semester, the lanyard from my campus ID, a coffee cup from the shop I frequented. Everything that identified me as a specific person who'd existed in a specific place. My diploma stayed with me, sealed in waterproof plastic inside my backpack. Some things were too hard-earned to abandon. I walked 3 miles in the rain to where Sam waited in his truck on a logging road invisible from the highway. He had the heater running and a thermos of coffee waiting, and when I climbed into the cab, soaking wet for the second time in 4 years, the parallel wasn't lost on either of us. "Last chance to change your mind," he said, not starting the engine yet. "I'm not changing my mind. Grace Allen will be gone after this. Really gone. You understand that?" I touched the bracelet on my wrist, felt its weight. "Grace Allen died the night you found me. This is just making it official." The news reported my disappearance the next day. Local woman missing after car found abandoned on Highway 26. Foul play not suspected but cannot be ruled out. By the end of the week, my face was on flyers posted around Portland, and the police had interviewed everyone I knew. My former roommate told reporters I'd seemed stressed but hopeful about my new job. Professor Wu stated I was an exemplary student who'd overcome significant hardship. No one mentioned family because I'd never spoken of them to anyone except Sam. My parents' statement came 3 days after the news broke. I read it on my phone from the passenger seat of Sam's truck as we drove south toward California, putting miles between me and everything Grace Allen had been. "We are devastated to learn of our daughter's disappearance," my father was quoted as saying. "Grace has been missing from our lives for years, and we've never stopped hoping she'd come home. Now we fear the worst. We ask anyone with information to please come forward." The performance was flawless. Grieving parents who'd already lost one daughter now facing the possibility she was truly gone. The article mentioned Evan, now 17, and being scouted by Division I baseball programs, described as the family's remaining hope in the face of unimaginable tragedy. I showed the article to Sam. He read it in silence, jaw tight, then handed back my phone without comment. California welcomed us with sunshine that felt obscene after Oregon's perpetual gray. Sam had a friend who owned a cabin in the mountains north of Sacramento, remote enough for privacy, but close enough to civilization for practical purposes. We stayed there for 2 months while I established residency, and Sam helped me navigate the legal system. The name change petition was surprisingly straightforward. California allowed it for survivors of domestic abuse without requiring the new name to be published in newspapers, the records sealed from public access. I sat across from a family court judge, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, and told a carefully edited version of my story: abandonment, homelessness, the need to sever ties with an abusive past and build a new future. She approved it without hesitation. "Good luck, Ms. Walker," she said, signing the order. "I hope you find the peace you're looking for." Grace Walker. The name felt strange in my mouth at first, like borrowed clothes that didn't quite fit, but I wore it, practiced signing it, introduced myself with it until it became as real as any name I'd ever carried. The cabin had a television, ancient and temperamental, but it picked up basic channels. One evening in late August, I caught a human interest piece on a Portland news station. My parents again, this time being interviewed about coping with loss. My mother looked thinner, older, her yellow cardigan replaced with somber gray. My father had developed a tremor in his hands that the camera caught when he reached for my mother's shoulder. "We've established a scholarship fund in Grace's name," he said, voice heavy with manufactured grief, "to help young women in difficult circumstances pursue their education. It's what she would have wanted." They were profiting from my disappearance, turning my absence into an opportunity for public sympathy and tax deductions. The audacity of it should have enraged me. Instead, I felt my lips curve into something that wasn't quite a smile. That night, I wrote in my journal for the last time as Grace Allen. The entry was short, just 2 lines in my careful script. "Grace Allen died today. From now on, I'll live as if I was born from pain itself." I closed the journal, placed it in a box with my old driver's license and student ID, and sealed it. Someday I might need proof of who I'd been, but for now, those artifacts of a discarded life could stay buried. Sam found me on the cabin's porch the next morning, watching mist rise from the valley below. He didn't ask if I was ready. He knew I'd been ready since the night he found me at that gas station, since the moment I'd realized survival wasn't enough. "Where to first?" he asked. "Portland," I said. "I start my new job in 2 weeks. Time to see what Grace Walker can build." Grace Allen is dead. Only Grace Walker remains the one who will make them regret everything. Grace Walker's first day at Pacific Northwest Community Bank was unremarkable by design. I wore a conservative navy suit from a discount store, carried a leather portfolio Sam had given me as a rebirth gift, and introduced myself to my new colleagues with a smile that revealed nothing. The bank occupied a modest building in a working-class neighborhood of Portland, serving customers who cashed paychecks and opened savings accounts with $20 deposits. It wasn't prestigious, but that was precisely the point. I needed to learn from the ground up to understand how money moved at every level before I could manipulate those movements to my advantage. My supervisor, Gerald Hutchins, was a man in his early 50s with a paunch that strained his shirt buttons and a habit of calling female employees sweetheart. He assigned me to accounts receivable, treating it as grunt work beneath his attention. I treated it as a masterclass in financial behavior, documenting every transaction in spreadsheets I maintained separately from the bank's official systems. Numbers told stories if you knew how to read them, and I was becoming fluent in their language. 3 months into my tenure, I noticed something wrong. Small discrepancies in Gerald's department funds that appeared in one ledger but not another, transfers that happened just before audits and reversed just after. The amounts were modest enough to escape casual notice, a few hundred here, 1,000 there. But over the 18 months Gerald had supervised the department, they totaled nearly $80,000. I could have reported it immediately to upper management, but Professor Wu's lessons had taught me better. Accusations without ironclad proof were just noise, especially when made by a junior employee against a manager. So I hired a private investigation firm using money from my carefully hoarded savings, gave them my documentation, and waited while they built a case that could survive legal scrutiny. When I finally walked into the bank president's office with a bound report detailing Gerald's embezzlement, complete with bank statements, transfer records, and a paper trail showing money flowing into his personal accounts, the look on President Morrison's face was worth every penny I'd spent. Gerald was fired that afternoon, escorted out by security, while I watched from my desk with no expression at all. The following week, Morrison promoted me to Gerald's position, quadrupling my salary and moving me into an office with a window. I was 23 years old and suddenly responsible for a department of 8 people, most of them twice my age. "You saved this bank," Morrison told me during my first week in the new role. "The board wanted you to know that kind of integrity doesn't go unnoticed." But it wasn't integrity that had motivated me. It was the understanding that true justice didn't live in courtrooms where lawyers performed for juries. It lived in contracts and documentation and having enough evidence that your enemies couldn't fight back without destroying themselves. This was the real power, not dramatic confrontations, but quiet, methodical accumulation of leverage. I opened my first serious investment account that month, separate from the modest savings I'd built during college. I studied market trends, obsessively read annual reports until my eyes burned, and made calculated investments in stable companies with strong fundamentals. Nothing flashy, nothing risky. Just steady, patient wealth building that compounded over time. Sam visited less frequently now. He was aging faster than I wanted to acknowledge, his movements slower. His breathing sometimes labored after climbing stairs. One Saturday, when he came to my apartment, I insisted on helping him organize the boxes of paperwork he'd been storing in his truck, financial records and receipts he claimed to need for tax purposes but had clearly been putting off sorting. That's when I found the canceled checks. A stack of them, all made out to Maplewood Senior Care Facility, dated monthly going back 5 years. The amounts varied, but averaged around $2,000 each. I stared at them confused, until I noticed the memo line on the oldest one. For Mrs. Eleanor Allen. My grandmother's name. My grandmother, who died 7 years ago, 2 years before my parents abandoned me, according to what my father had told me. My grandmother, whose death I'd mourned alone because no one had thought to take me to the funeral. "Sam," I said quietly, holding up the check. "What is this?" The look on his face told me everything before he spoke. Guilt, resignation, the expression of someone who'd been keeping a necessary secret and knew the reckoning had finally arrived. "Your grandmother didn't die," he said simply. "Your father lied to you. He put her in that facility and stopped paying after 6 months. I found out when they were about to transfer her to state care. I couldn't let that happen." The room tilted slightly. I sat down hard on Sam's couch, the canceled checks scattered across my lap like evidence of a crime I couldn't quite name. "She's alive!" My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "She's been alive this whole time and you never told me." "I wanted to," Sam said, and I could hear the truth of it in his voice. "But you were building a new life, Grace. You were healing. I didn't know if bringing her back into your world would help or hurt you." I drove to Maplewood Senior Care Facility that afternoon, not bothering to call ahead, not sure what I'd find when I got there. The building was pleasant enough, a converted house in a quiet neighborhood with wheelchair ramps and grab bars installed outside. A kind-faced nurse named Patricia met me at the desk. "I'm here to see Eleanor Allen," I said, and even saying the name felt surreal. Patricia's expression shifted to something gentle and sad. "Oh, are you family?" "We don't get many visitors for Eleanor. Just that sweet older gentleman who comes every month. He says she's his old friend's mother." My grandmother sat in a chair by a window overlooking a small garden. She was smaller than I remembered, shrunken in the way very old people become, her white hair thin and carefully brushed. When I said her name, she looked up at me with eyes that had once sparkled with recognition and love, eyes that now held nothing but vague confusion. "Do I know you, dear?" she asked in a wavering voice. "I'm Grace," I said, kneeling beside her chair. "I'm your granddaughter." She patted my hand absently. "That's a lovely name. I had a granddaughter named Grace once. Such a sweet girl. I wonder whatever happened to her." I stayed for an hour sitting with her while she talked about people I didn't know and events that might have happened 50 years ago or yesterday, for all the clarity her dementia allowed. When I left, I wrote a check to the facility administrator for 12 months of care, in advance the largest amount I'd ever written, more than half my savings account. Sam was waiting in his truck outside, knowing somehow that I'd need him when I emerged. "How long has she been like this?" I asked. 3 years, maybe more. The dementia came on gradually, then all at once. I thought about my father telling me she was dead, erasing her from my life with casual cruelty. I thought about the funeral I'd grieved through the grave that didn't exist. I thought about how many times I could have visited her, talked to her before the disease stole her mind. "Thank you," I said to Sam, meaning it with every fiber of my being, "for taking care of her when no one else would. Money can't buy love, but it can buy power." The Pacific Northwest Finance Summit took place at a downtown Portland hotel, one of those events where professionals networked over coffee that cost more than some people's hourly wage and exchanged business cards with the practiced efficiency of card dealers. I'd been attending for 3 years now, first as an observer trying to learn the landscape, then as a participant with actual credentials worth sharing. Professor Margaret Wu had called me 2 weeks earlier with an unusual request. "There's someone I want you to meet," she'd said. "Potential consulting partner for a project I'm developing. Smart, ethical, and he's been through some hard times that gave him perspective. I think you two would work well together." I trusted Professor Wu's judgment implicitly, so when she guided me through the conference hall toward a man standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, I was prepared to be professionally courteous. What I wasn't prepared for was the jolt of recognition that hit me when he turned around. David Brennan looked older, the boyish softness gone from his face, replaced by angles that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. His sandy brown hair showed threads of gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. He wore a well-cut suit that suggested success but not excess. And when Professor Wu introduced us, his handshake was firm and brief. "Grace Walker," he said, testing the name. "Professor Wu speaks very highly of you. Says you have an unusual gift for seeing patterns others miss." "I pay attention," I said, keeping my voice level professional. "The numbers tell stories if you're willing to listen." He didn't recognize me. Why would he? The Grace Allen he'd known had been a college student with unstyled hair and thrift store clothes, someone who'd moved through the world trying not to take up too much space. Grace Walker wore designer suits purchased with her own money, carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd clawed her way up and knew exactly what she was worth. I'd learned to style my hair in a sleek, professional cut, mastered makeup that enhanced without drawing attention, developed a manner of speaking that commanded rooms. We talked for 20 minutes about Professor Wu's proposed project, a consulting initiative to help small businesses navigate complex financial regulations. David's role would be strategic planning, mine would be financial analysis and risk assessment. The conversation was intelligent-focused, exactly what a business discussion should be. But I found myself watching him for tells, for glimpses of the man who'd held my hand in library stacks and promised me we'd build something together. He touched his left wrist when Professor Wu asked a challenging question about resource allocation. Just a brief gesture, fingers brushing the spot where I'd once tied a friendship bracelet made of blue and silver thread, his school colors. The bracelet had been cheap, something I'd made during a study break, but he'd worn it for months until the threads frayed and broke. That small, unconscious gesture, that ghost of a memory living in his muscle memory, told me more than any words could have. He hadn't completely forgotten. Over the following months, the consulting project brought us into regular contact. We met for coffee to discuss strategy, exchanged emails late at night when financial reports needed analysis, occasionally grabbed lunch between meetings. I watched him carefully cataloging the changes time had carved into him. Professor Wu had mentioned his divorce in passing, a marriage that had ended badly when his wife had an affair with her father's business partner, the ultimate betrayal of the sacrifice David had made. What struck me most was how he treated people. The barista who made his coffee, the junior analyst who brought reports to our meetings, the cleaning staff who worked in the conference rooms we used. He was kind to all of them, not performatively but genuinely remembering names and asking about their lives with real interest. The David I'd known in college had been good, but this David was better humbled by whatever fire he'd walked through. During one meeting, his phone rang, and I glimpsed the caller ID before he declined it. Catherine Brennan. His ex-wife, still using his name, apparently still calling. He looked at me apologetically. Sorry, she still hasn't quite accepted that it's over. Divorce is complicated, I said neutrally. This one was necessary. He set the phone face down on the table. I married for all the wrong reasons. Thought I was saving my family, but really I was just taking the coward's way out. Cost me everything that actually mattered. There was something in his voice, a regret so deep it had worn grooves in his soul. I wanted to ask what he meant by everything that mattered, but that would require revealing more interest than Grace Walker should have in his personal history. He started finding excuses to extend our meetings, suggesting we grab dinner to discuss a complex section of a report that could easily have been covered in an email. Invited me to a gallery opening his firm was sponsoring, framing it as networking, but watching me with an attention that went beyond professional courtesy. Once, when I made a joke about a particularly absurd regulatory requirement, he laughed with surprise in his eyes, that same laugh I remembered from late nights in the university library. You remind me of someone, he said suddenly one evening over drinks after a particularly long meeting. We were at a quiet wine bar, the kind of place where conversations stayed private. Someone I knew a long time ago. The way you think, the way you phrase things. It's uncanny. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained calm. People say I have one of those familiar faces. It's not your face, he said, studying me with an intensity that made me want to look away. It's something else. Something I can't quite place. He was falling for Grace Walker without knowing she was Grace Allen wearing a different name. Was courting the woman he'd abandoned with the same gentle persistence he'd used before, except this time he was divorced, damaged, presumably available. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't lodged in my chest like a stone. I could tell him. I could watch his face transform with recognition and shock. I could make him understand exactly what he'd lost. But something held me back. Maybe curiosity about how far he'd go. Maybe the cold satisfaction of knowing he was attracted to the person he'd deemed not worth fighting for. Maybe just the strategic value of keeping one more card close to my vest. He's courting the woman he once abandoned, only he doesn't know it's still me. The venture capital pitch meeting was supposed to be routine, one of a dozen I'd conducted that quarter for the consulting firm David and I had officially launched. We sat in a glass-walled conference room on the 20th floor of a downtown building, presenting financial projections to 3 potential investors who looked at their phones more than our slides. I was midway through explaining our client retention strategy when the door opened and a man walked in who commanded immediate attention without saying a word. Lucas Hartwell was in his late 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that whispered old money rather than shouting it. He had the kind of weathered, handsome face that suggested he'd lived a full life and learned from it, sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and a presence that made the other investors straighten in their chairs and pocket their phones. My apologies for the interruption, he said, his voice carrying the faint trace of an East Coast education. I saw the name of the firm on the building directory and couldn't resist sitting in. Grace Walker, is it? That's right, I said, thrown off balance by both his entrance and the intensity of his gaze. And you are? Lucas Hartwell. I knew someone with your last name once. A long time ago. Something flickered in his expression there and gone before I could read it. Please continue your presentation. Pretend I'm not here. But that was impossible. He sat at the end of the table, still as a statue, watching me with an attention that felt almost physical. When I explained our risk assessment methodology, he nodded slightly. When David discussed our growth projections, Lucas's eyes never left my face. It should have been unnerving, but instead I found myself presenting better than I ever had, rising to meet the challenge of someone who was actually listening. After the meeting, while the other investors filed out with non-committal pleasantries, Lucas approached me directly. Walk with me, he said. And it wasn't quite a question. David glanced at me, and I nodded that I'd be fine. Lucas and I rode the elevator down in silence, emerging onto the busy downtown street, where autumn leaves scattered across the sidewalk. "The last name Walker," Lucas said as we walked with no apparent destination. "Is that your married name?" "It's my legal name," I said carefully. "I changed it several years ago." "And before that?" "Before that doesn't matter anymore." He smiled slightly at that, an expression that held approval. "Fair enough. Tell me about your family. Your parents." The question should have raised alarms, but something in his manner suggested this wasn't idle curiosity. "I don't have contact with my biological family. I was raised by people who didn't particularly want me, and I left that situation behind." "I see." We stopped at a small park, one of those urban green spaces with benches and a fountain. Lucas gestured for me to sit. "May I ask you something personal? That birthmark on your left wrist, the small one shaped like a comma. Have you always had it?" Instinctively, I touched the spot he'd somehow noticed despite the long sleeves I wore. "Since birth, according to my grandmother." "Why?" "Because I knew someone who had an identical mark in the exact same place." His voice had gone quiet, distant. "Someone I lost a very long time ago." Before I could respond, Lucas pulled out a checkbook. "I'm investing $200,000 in your firm. Not because of your presentation, though it was excellent. Because I believe in you, specifically, Grace Walker. I see something in you that reminds me of someone I once failed to protect." The check he wrote was made out to Walker Brennan Consulting for an amount that would stabilize our first year completely. I stared at it, stunned. "I don't understand," I said. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough." He handed me a business card along with the check. "Call me next week. I'd like to mentor you if you're willing. Teach you some things about business that don't get covered in university finance programs." Over the following months, Lucas became a fixture in my professional life. We met for coffee every Wednesday morning at a cafe near his office, conversations that started with business strategy and evolved into something deeper. He taught me about leveraging relationships, about reading people's motivations, about the difference between revenge and justice. "Forgiveness isn't mercy," he told me one morning when I'd mentioned struggling with anger towards someone from my past. "It's strategy. The person who knows when to forgive, when to hold grudges, and when to simply cut losses and walk away, that person always wins. Because they're not controlled by emotion. They're controlled by calculation." The philosophy resonated with something fundamental in me. I'd spent years nursing anger toward my parents, toward David, toward everyone who'd hurt me. Lucas was teaching me to channel that anger into something more useful than rage. During one session in his office, a converted loft with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows, I noticed a photograph on his desk. It was old, the colors slightly faded, showing two young men in their 20s standing in front of what looked like a construction site. One of them was clearly Lucas, decades younger, his arm around the shoulders of another man who looked unsettlingly familiar. Same build as my father, same stance, same cold eyes, even in a photograph meant to capture friendship. "Old business partner," Lucas said when he caught me looking. "From before I learned that some people see partnerships as opportunities for betrayal rather than mutual success." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push, but the image stayed with me. That photograph, the way Lucas had appeared in my life with such specific interest, the birthmark he'd noticed, the investment that seemed more personal than professional pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite assemble. What I did understand was his lesson about forgiveness. It crystallized something I'd been circling for years, gave shape to the formless anger that had driven me since that gas station. I understand now, forgiveness isn't mercy. It's strategy. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under my apartment door sometime during the night. I found it when I left for my morning run, a plain white envelope with no return address, and my name written in shaking feminine handwriting that looked like it had been penned by someone whose hands wouldn't stop trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message brief and unsigned. "They're looking for you. Your family is collapsing. I thought you should know. I stood in my hallway holding that paper, my heart rate climbing for reasons that had nothing to do with exercise. The handwriting wasn't my mother's, though. There was something familiar about the way certain letters curved. Someone who knew where I lived, who I really was beneath the Walker name, and who felt compelled to warn me. The fact that they'd delivered it by hand rather than mail suggested they lived nearby or had gone to significant effort to maintain anonymity. I called the private investigation firm I'd used to expose Gerald's embezzlement 3 years earlier. By the end of the week, I had a comprehensive report on my biological family that read like a catalog of slow-motion disaster. Caleb Allen's construction company had filed for bankruptcy protection 6 months ago, after a series of failed projects and allegations of building code violations. His reputation in the industry was ruined, his assets seized or sold to pay creditors. The house I'd grown up in had been foreclosed on the contents auctioned off. He was living in a rented apartment in a part of town where desperation hung in the air like smoke. Ruth Allen had been hospitalized twice in the past year for severe anxiety and what the medical records delicately termed acute stress response. She was on a cocktail of medications and seeing a therapist weekly, though insurance covered less and less as Caleb's financial situation deteriorated. The investigator's report included a note from a neighbor who'd been interviewed. Mrs. Allen talks to herself sometimes, keeps saying she's sorry over and over but won't say what for. Evan Allen, now 22, had lost his Division I baseball scholarship after an injury sophomore year and dropped out of college. He was working as an assistant manager at a sporting goods store, living with his parents in that rented apartment, his athletic promise reduced to selling equipment to kids with dreams he'd once shared. The investigator had found social media posts showing a young man trying desperately to maintain an image of success while everything crumbled around him. They were looking for me, the report confirmed. Caleb had hired a cheap private investigator 8 months ago to search for Grace Allen, providing an old high school photo and a description that was 7 years out of date. The investigator had found nothing because Grace Allen had legally ceased to exist, her trail ending at an abandoned car on Highway 26 and a missing person case that had gone cold. I should have felt satisfaction reading about their downfall, vindication that the universe had delivered justice without requiring my intervention. Instead, I felt something more complicated, a tangle of emotions I couldn't quite name. Part of me, the part that remembered being 17 and desperate for any scrap of parental love, wanted to reach out to help to fix things the way I'd learned to fix broken financial systems. But another part, the part that had survived by becoming someone new, remembered the gas station with crystal clarity, remembered the sound of tires on snow, my mother's tearful silence, my father's calculated cruelty. Remembered writing in my journal by firelight, documenting my own potential death while they drove home to their warm house and their favored son. I sat in my apartment with the investigation report spread across my dining table and Lucas's words echoing in my mind. Forgiveness isn't mercy, it's strategy. The person who knows when to forgive always wins because they're not controlled by emotion. What would strategic forgiveness look like? Not the warm reconciliation they might be hoping for, but something colder, more calculated. Help that came with invisible strings assistance that placed me in a position of power over them, rather than the reverse. I began gathering information on Caleb's old company, pulling public records, court filings, business registrations. The bankruptcy proceedings had been messy, leaving several creditors unpaid, and a trail of angry subcontractors who'd never received payment for completed work. There were assets that had been hidden or transferred money that had moved through shell corporations in ways that suggested someone had been planning for bankruptcy long before filing. Caleb had always been good at covering his tracks, but he'd gotten sloppy in his desperation. And I'd learned from the best how to follow money through labyrinths of corporate structure, how to find what people thought they'd hidden. My phone rang. Lucas, our weekly check-in. I answered while still staring at the financial documents scattered before me. "You sound distracted," he observed. "Something on your mind." "A decision," I said, "about whether to help people who hurt me, and if so, how." "Ah." He was quiet for a moment. The most dangerous kind of help is the kind that looks like salvation, but binds the recipient to you forever. They think they're being rescued when really they're being acquired. Is that what you'd do? That's what I did do once. To someone who'd betrayed me. I saved his business when no one else would, and he spent the rest of his career in my debt, owing me favors he could never fully repay. He thought I'd forgiven him. I'd simply changed the terms of his punishment. I thought about that after we hung up, about the difference between revenge and control, between destruction and strategic dominance. My parents had tried to throw me away like garbage. Now they were drowning, and I had the power to pull them up, to place them exactly where I wanted them. I'll help them, but in ways they'll never expect. I returned to my hometown on a crisp October morning, driving a leased BMW that whispered success without shouting it. The town hadn't changed much in the 7 years since I'd left. Still the same tired Main Street with its struggling shops and faded awnings, still the same rural Oregon landscape where dreams came to die quietly. But I had changed everything, and that made all the difference. My business cards identified me as Grace Walker, Principal Investor, with Hartwell Walker Properties, a development company I'd established with Lucas's guidance specifically for this purpose. The cover story was simple and believable. I was scouting properties in economically depressed areas with potential for revitalization, looking for investment opportunities that would benefit both my portfolio and struggling communities. The real estate agent who showed me around town was an eager woman named Diane, who'd clearly been waiting years for someone with actual money to show interest in the area. She drove me past boarded-up storefronts and houses with for-sale signs that had weathered multiple seasons, narrating a story of economic decline with the desperate enthusiasm of someone hoping a fairy godmother had finally arrived. "This property just came available," she said as we pulled up to a house I would have recognized in my sleep. Foreclosure, sadly. The family that lived here fell on hard times. Banks motivated to sell. I stood on the cracked sidewalk, looking at the house where I'd spent 17 years learning that home and safety were not synonyms. The blue paint had faded to gray, the porch sagged more than I remembered, and someone had boarded up the front window that used to frame our plastic Christmas tree. It looked smaller now, diminished by time and distance, just a sad little house instead of the prison it had felt like. "I'll take it," I said, "and I'm interested in the adjoining lots as well. I'm thinking about a small residential development, something that brings young families back to the area." Diane's face lit up with commission calculation joy. Over the next 2 weeks, I purchased 6 properties in total, all foreclosures or tax sales, all acquired through proper legal channels with money Lucas had helped me leverage into a legitimate development fund. The purchases made local news, small-town reporters excited about outside investment and the possibility of economic renewal. That's when my father reached out. The email came through the general contact form on the Hartwell Walker Properties website, professionally worded but with an undercurrent of desperation I recognized from years of reading between lines. Caleb Allen, former construction company owner, requesting a meeting to discuss potential partnership opportunities. He had experience with local building codes and contractor relationships that could prove valuable to my development projects. Would Ms. Walker be interested in lunch to discuss mutual benefit? I scheduled the meeting at a cafe in the town square, a neutral location where I could control the environment. I arrived early, positioned myself at a table near the window where the afternoon light would be behind me, making my face slightly harder to read. I wore a tailored gray suit and the silver bracelet Sam had given me, touching it once for courage before they arrived. They walked in together, and I barely recognized them. My father had aged decades in 7 years, his shoulders rounded, his face, gaunt gray, threading through hair he'd always kept perfectly dark. He wore a suit that had been expensive once but now hung loose on his frame, cleaned but threadbare at the cuffs. My mother looked worse, moving with the careful steps of someone whose medication hasn't quite found the right balance. Her eyes clouded with something that might have been regret or might have been nothing at all. I stood to greet them, extending my hand with a practiced smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Allen, thank you for meeting with me. I'm Grace Walker." My father's handshake was firm, overcompensating for his diminished circumstances. Ms. Walker, we appreciate you taking the time. Your investment in our town has been quite remarkable. Please sit. I gestured to the chairs across from me, playing the role of beneficent investor with ease born from years of studying how power presents itself. I understand you have experience in construction. We talked for 30 minutes about zoning regulations and permit processes, about reliable contractors and material suppliers. My father performed capability, trying to convince me he still had value to offer, despite the bankruptcy that public records documented in humiliating detail. I listened with polite interest, asked intelligent questions, gave nothing away. My mother said almost nothing, just sat with her hands folded in her lap, occasionally glancing at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Once, when I laughed at something my father said, she flinched slightly, like the sound had physically hurt her. Near the end of our meeting, I leaned forward with manufactured warmth. I think there might be opportunities for collaboration here. Let me review my development timeline and I'll be in touch about potential consulting contracts. Nothing guaranteed, you understand, but I like to work with people who have local knowledge. The hope that bloomed in my father's face was almost painful to witness. False hope carefully planted the first thread of the web I was weaving. As we stood to leave, my mother finally spoke, her voice thin and wavering. "Thank you for considering us, Ms. Walker. You seem like such a kind person." She extended her hand to shake mine, and when our palms touched, when her clouded eyes met mine without recognition, I felt something cold and satisfied settle in my chest. When my mother shook my hand and said, "Lovely to meet you," I just smiled. The shell company that had purchased controlling shares in Allen Construction's remaining assets was registered in Delaware, buried under 3 layers of corporate structure that would take a forensic accountant weeks to untangle. Lucas had taught me well about how to move through business transactions like a ghost visible only when you chose to be. The purchase was perfectly legal, executed during the bankruptcy proceedings when desperate creditors were selling anything with potential value. What Caleb didn't know was that the anonymous buyer who'd acquired his company's name, contracts, and remaining goodwill was connected to the real estate investor who'd bought his house and offered him false hope over coffee. The key to elegant revenge, Lucas had told me while structuring the acquisition, is that your target never sees you coming. They should feel the consequences without understanding the cause until it's far too late to defend themselves. The private investigation firm I hired was the same one I'd used before, professionals who understood the difference between unethical and illegal. I gave them a simple directive: examine every financial transaction Allen Construction had made in its final 3 years of operation. Look for discrepancies between what was reported to the IRS and what actually happened. Follow the money wherever it led. What they found was a masterclass in small-time fraud. Caleb had been skimming for years, underreporting income-inflating expenses, paying workers under the table to avoid payroll taxes, and funneling money through shell corporations he thought he'd hidden well enough. The amounts weren't massive, nothing that would trigger automatic audits, but accumulated over time, they represented substantial tax evasion. The investigator's report was 3 inches thick, every claim backed by bank records, invoices, and testimony from former employees who'd been stiffed when the company collapsed. I submitted the report to the IRS with a cover letter identifying myself as a concerned citizen and real estate investor who'd discovered these irregularities while conducting due diligence on local contractors. The IRS moved with the inexorable patience of an avalanche, slow but unstoppable. Their investigation took 4 months, during which time I continued my polite correspondence with Caleb about potential consulting opportunities, keeping hope dangling just out of reach. The day the IRS agents knocked on the door of his rented apartment, I was having coffee with Lucas at our usual cafe. He received a text message, read it, and looked up at me with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something darker. "It's done," he said simply. "The IRS has filed charges. Criminal tax evasion, multiple counts." I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt oddly hollow, like I'd won a game that had cost too much to play. Will he go to prison? Probably not at his age and with no prior record. But he'll lose everything that's left and his reputation will be destroyed completely. No one in the construction industry will touch him after this. Lucas set down his coffee cup and looked at me with an intensity I'd learned meant he was about to tell me something important. That man destroyed me once, 30 years ago. We were partners building something good, and he sabotaged it all to take control. Cost me my company, my reputation, and something far more precious than money. His voice went quiet. Now we call it karma. The way he said it, the weight of those 3 decades made me realize this wasn't just mentorship. Lucas had his own reasons for helping me bring down Caleb Allen, reasons that went deeper than business acumen and pattern recognition. What did he take from you? I asked. Everything that mattered, Lucas said, and wouldn't elaborate further. The news of Caleb's indictment spread through town like wildfire. I heard about it from Diane, my real estate agent, who called breathless with scandal and concern about whether this would affect my development projects. I assured her it wouldn't, that I'd been wise enough to keep Caleb at arm's length, that my due diligence had revealed enough red flags to make me cautious. The investigators' subsequent reports detailed the family's disintegration with clinical precision. Ruth had stopped taking her anxiety medication and spent days in bed barely eating, mumbling apologies to people who weren't there. Evan had moved out of their apartment, crashing with friends, telling anyone who'd listen that he'd always known his father was crooked. The unified front they'd presented to the world, the grieving family who'd lost their daughter, splintered into individual survivors, scrambling for their own lifeboats. I drove past their apartment building one evening, saw the lights on in the window of the unit I knew was theirs, and wondered what conversations were happening inside. What accusations, what blame, what recriminations for choices made years ago that had led them to this moment. My phone rang, Sam checking in as he did weekly since his health had started to decline. "You doing okay?" he asked, and I knew he wasn't asking about work. "I'm doing what needs to be done. There's a difference between justice and cruelty, Grace. Make sure you know which one you're serving." I thought about that after we hung up, sitting in my car, watching those lit windows. My father was inside that apartment, probably reviewing legal documents he couldn't afford a lawyer to explain, facing consequences for crimes he'd absolutely committed. This wasn't cruelty. This was accountability delivered by someone who'd learned to use the system's own rules as weapons. He doesn't know the person who took everything from him is the daughter he abandoned. The invitation was printed on heavy cream cardstock with elegant calligraphy, the kind of formal dinner invitation that people in small towns received so rarely they kept them on their refrigerators. Grace Walker requests the pleasure of your company at an intimate gathering to discuss community revitalization and partnership opportunities. Black tie optional. A private dining room at the nicest restaurant within 50 miles, the kind of place where reservations required weeks of advance notice, and entrees cost more than some people's weekly groceries. I knew they would come. Desperation has a way of making people accept invitations they might otherwise question. The dining room I'd reserved seated 20, but I'd only invited 12 carefully selected guests, local business owners who'd survived the economic downturn. The mayor and 2 city council members, a journalist from the regional newspaper, and Caleb and Ruth Allen positioned at the table where the light would hit them perfectly, where everyone could see their faces clearly. I arrived early to oversee the arrangements, ensuring every detail matched the image I wanted to project. White tablecloths, crystal stemware, centerpieces of white roses that cost more than my parents' monthly rent. Lucas would be there. I'd confirmed, sitting strategically at the far end of the table where he could observe without drawing attention until the moment I needed him. They arrived 10 minutes early, my parents dressed in clothes I recognized as their best, despite the wear showing at the seams. My mother wore a navy dress that hung loose on her frame, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a small purse. My father had gained back a little weight, probably from stress eating, but his face still carried the haggard look of a man waiting for the other shoe to drop. The criminal tax case was pending, his lawyer working out a plea deal that would spare him prison in exchange for every remaining asset he possessed. They didn't recognize me. Didn't. Why would they? I wore a black cocktail dress that cost more than their monthly car payment. Used to be my hair styled by a professional diamonds at my throat that Lucas had loaned me for the evening because he understood the psychology of wealth. I was Grace Walker, successful investor, their potential savior, not Grace Allen, the daughter they'd left to freeze. During cocktails, I circulated among the guests, playing the gracious host. My father managed to corner me near the bar, his practiced smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Ms. Walker, Ruth and I wanted to thank you again for the invitation. We're very encouraged by your vision for the town." "It's important to invest in communities," I said smoothly, "to help people rebuild after they've fallen on hard times. Everyone deserves a second chance, don't you think?" Something flickered in his eyes, too quick to read. Very generous perspective. My mother appeared at his elbow, her medication-clouded gaze trying to focus on my face. "You remind me of someone," she said softly, and my heart rate spiked before she continued. "A teacher I had in high school. Same kind eyes. Kind eyes. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so perfectly tragic." At dinner, I positioned myself at the head of the table, Lucas at the opposite end, my parents in the middle, where they could be seen by everyone. The journalist was taking notes. The mayor was already planning his re-election campaign around this revitalization initiative, and the other guests were relaxed, enjoying wine that cost more per bottle than they'd admit to their spouses. My father, emboldened by 2 glasses of Cabernet, began telling stories about the construction business, trying to rehabilitate his reputation through charm and selective memory. Then inevitably the conversation turned personal. "Your own children must be very proud of what you've accomplished, Ms. Walker," the mayor's wife said with wine-loosened curiosity. "I don't have children," I said. "I've focused entirely on building my career." "Such a shame," my mother said, her voice carrying across the table with unexpected clarity. "We had a daughter once. She went missing years ago. Grace. She would have been about your age now." The table went quiet with that particular silence that accompanies tragedy mentioned at social gatherings. Sympathetic murmurs rippled through the guests. "We still hope she'll come home someday," my father added, playing his role perfectly. "Every holiday, every birthday, we wonder where she is. Whether she's safe, whether she's happy." I let the moment breathe, let everyone absorb this touching display of parental grief. Then I stood, my wineglass in hand, and the room fell silent in that way rooms do when someone with power is about to speak. "Before we move to dessert, I'd like to propose a toast," I said, my voice steady despite my heart hammering against my ribs. "To second chances, to accountability, and to the truth, no matter how long it takes to surface." I paused, making eye contact with each guest, before letting my gaze settle on my parents. "My name isn't just Grace Walker," I said clearly. "It's Grace Allen. Perhaps that name reminds you of something." I watched the color drain from my father's face, watched my mother's expression cycle through confusion to recognition, to something that might have been horror or might have been relief. The other guests looked between us, not understanding yet, but sensing the shift in atmosphere like animals before an earthquake. Before anyone could speak, Lucas rose from his seat at the far end of the table. He moved with deliberate calm, every eye turning to him. "Caleb," he said, his voice carrying 30 years of patient rage. "Do you remember me?" My father's head snapped toward Lucas, and I watched recognition hit him like a physical blow. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "30 years ago, you took my company, my dignity, and something far more precious than either." Lucas's voice never rose, never wavered. "Today, justice has arrived." The room was frozen, everyone holding their breath, waiting for an explanation that neither Lucas nor I was ready to give. My mother's wineglass slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the china plate with a sound like a gunshot. My mother dropped her wineglass, and I simply said, "Enjoy your meal." The silence that followed my mother's shattered wineglass stretched like a wire pulled taut, everyone in that elegant dining room suspended in the moment before understanding crashes down. My father found his voice first, though it came out strangled and wrong. "Grace, that's impossible. You're dead. You disappeared. We looked for you." "You looked for me," I heard my voice rise, despite my intention to stay cold and controlled. You drove away and left me at an abandoned gas station in sub-zero temperatures. You didn't look for me. You waited for someone to confirm I'd frozen to death so you could play the role of grieving parents. My mother made a sound like a wounded animal and pushed back from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She took 2 unsteady steps toward me before her legs gave out and she collapsed to her knees, hands reaching out in supplication. "Grace, please, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to. He made me. I left you the church card. I hoped someone would find you. Please, baby, please forgive me." My father stood frozen, his face cycling through denial to fear to calculation, looking for an exit from a trap that had already closed around him. Then he too dropped to his knees, the performance instinct that had served him so well kicking in even now. "We were wrong," he said, his voice taking on that practiced tone of contrition I'd heard him use with building inspectors and angry clients. "We were young and foolish and we made a terrible mistake. But we're still your parents. We still love you." The other guests sat paralyzed, the mayor looking like he wanted to leave, but couldn't figure out how, without making things worse, the journalist's pen moving rapidly across her notepad. Lucas remained standing at his end of the table, a silent witness to the unraveling. I reached into the slim portfolio I'd placed beside my chair and pulled out a weathered journal, its cover stained and warped from that night by the fire in the gas station. My hands were steady as I opened it to the page I'd marked with a ribbon. "Let me share something I wrote 7 years ago," I said, my voice clear and cold. "December 24th, Christmas Eve. They left me at an abandoned gas station off Highway 26. I heard Dad say they wanted to teach me a lesson about gratitude. Mom cried but did nothing to stop it. The temperature is -5 Celsius. I don't know if anyone will find me. If I die here, let this journal be proof of what they did." My mother was sobbing openly now, her whole body shaking. My father had gone very still, his eyes darting toward the exits, toward Lucas, toward anywhere but my face. "That's not evidence," he managed. "That's just a journal. You could have written that any time." I pulled out the second document, official letterhead visible across the room. "This is the police report from December 25th, 7 years ago. Public record available to anyone who requests it. It documents how a man named Sam Porter found a 17-year-old girl malnourished, suffering from hypothermia and shock at an abandoned gas station. How she begged him not to take her back to her parents because they would kill her just in a different way." I set the report on the table where everyone could see it, the official language of law enforcement lending weight to what my parents had dismissed as teenage dramatics. The report also notes that when police contacted Caleb and Ruth Allen, they claimed their daughter had run away during a stop for gas, that they'd been searching for her. But there were no missing person reports filed, no search parties organized, no desperate parents calling police stations and hospitals. I looked directly at my father. "You told everyone I'd run away. You built your sympathy on my disappearance. Started a scholarship fund in my name while hoping I was actually dead." Outside the restaurant windows, snow had begun to fall, thick flakes illuminated by the red neon sign of the bar across the street. The crimson light reflected off the white accumulation, painting the scene in shades of blood and ice. The mayor cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should give the family privacy." "No," I said sharply. "Stay. I want witnesses to this. I want everyone in this room to understand exactly who Caleb and Ruth Allen are, what they're capable of. So when they come to you asking for sympathy, for help, for anything, you'll remember this moment." I turned back to my parents, still kneeling on the floor of this expensive restaurant, their desperation finally real instead of performed. "You wanted to teach me a lesson about gratitude," I said quietly, "about appreciating what I had. Well, I learned it. I learned that family means nothing, that love is conditional, that the only person I could ever truly rely on was myself." I touched the silver bracelet on my wrist. Sam's gift, the word survive catching the light. I carry that lesson with me to this day. Thank you for teaching it so thoroughly. My mother reached toward me, her face streaked with tears and running makeup. "Please, Grace. We can fix this. We can be a family again." "We were never a family," I said. "We were just people who shared a house until you decided I was too expensive to keep." I gathered my portfolio and turned to leave, Lucas falling into step beside me. At the door, I looked back one final time at the tableau we were leaving behind. My parents on their knees among broken glass and spilled wine. The other guests frozen in their chairs, bearing witness to a reckoning years in the making. The snow falling outside, red and white, beautiful and terrible. I haven't forgiven them. I've only just begun. The nightmares came back that night worse than they'd been in years. Not the usual dreams of tires on snow or my father's cold laugh, but something new and more insidious. My mother's voice broken and desperate, saying, "I'm so sorry," over and over, until the words lost meaning and became just sound, just pain, given vocal form. I woke at 3 a.m. to find I'd been crying in my sleep, something I hadn't done since my first year at Haven House. Every time it snowed after that dinner, I heard her voice. Not the strong, clear voice from my journal reading, but the cracked, pleading tone from when she'd collapsed to her knees. It followed me through my days like a ghost, whispering guilt when I should have felt vindication. Sam called 2 days after the dinner. His voice sounded weaker than I'd ever heard it, the rasp of someone whose body was finally admitting what his spirit had denied for years. "I heard about what happened at the restaurant," he said. "The journalist's article is making rounds. You got what you wanted." "Did I?" I stared out my apartment window at the city lights, feeling hollow despite my victory. Because it doesn't feel the way I thought it would. "Revenge rarely does." He coughed a wet sound that made my chest tighten. "Grace, I need to see you. Soon. There are things I should have told you a long time ago." "I can drive down this weekend." "Make it tomorrow," he said. "I don't think I have many weekends left." The hospice where Sam had been moved was one of those places that tried to disguise death with soft lighting and gentle colors, as if pastel walls could make the inevitable less terrifying. He'd refused treatment for the lung cancer he told me when I arrived, had refused everything except pain management. At 73, he'd decided he was ready to meet whatever came next. He looked so small in the hospital bed, this man who'd seemed indestructible when he'd pulled me from that gas station. His weathered hands, which had taught me to change oil and read contracts, trembled slightly as he reached for the envelope on his bedside table. "Read this after I'm gone," he said, pressing it into my hands. "But I'll tell you the important parts now while I can still see your face." He told me about Lucas Hartwell, about how 30 years ago they'd been partners in a construction business, young men with big dreams and complementary skills. Told me about Caleb Allen, who'd worked for them as a project manager, who'd seemed trustworthy until he'd systematically sabotaged their reputation with clients' stolen contracts and destroyed their partnership from within. Lucas had the money to rebuild. Sam said, his breathing labored. I didn't. Lost everything. My house, my marriage, my self-respect. Spent 10 years angry and another 10 trying to figure out how to live with that anger. He paused, gathering strength. "When I found you that night shivering in that gas station, and you told me your name was Grace Allen, something clicked. I looked into it, found out Caleb was your father, and I realized the universe was giving me a chance." A chance for what? To be the man I should have been 30 years ago. To stand up to Caleb in a way I'd been too weak to do before. I couldn't save myself, but maybe I could save you. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and unstoppable. You did save me. You saved my life. Saved my... I know. He smiled, the same gentle smile that had greeted me every Saturday morning with coffee and lessons. And watching you grow, watching you become this fierce, brilliant woman that saved me too, fixed something in me that I thought was broken forever. Sam died 3 days later in his sleep, peacefully according to the nurse who called. His funeral was small, just me, Lucas, and a handful of people from the church where he'd volunteered. They buried him on a gray November morning while I stood between Lucas and David, who'd come without being asked, somehow knowing I'd need him there. The letter was in my hands that evening, Sam's careful handwriting covering 2 pages of lined paper. Most of it echoed what he'd told me in the hospice, but the ending was new and it broke something in me I hadn't known was still whole. Grace, you've spent so many years building armor protecting yourself from ever being hurt again. That armor served you well. It kept you alive. But don't let it become a prison. When I saved you, I was fixing my own mistake, correcting my own cowardice. Forgiveness isn't for them, Grace. It's not about letting your parents off the hook or pretending what they did was acceptable. Forgiveness is for your soul, so you can finally be free of them. The final line was written in slightly shakier script, as if he'd paused before committing it to paper. I'm truly proud of you, daughter. Daughter, not Grace, not kid, daughter. I sat on my apartment floor, holding that letter, and cried until I had nothing left crying for Sam, for myself, for the girl I'd been, and the woman I'd become. The silver bracelet on my wrist felt heavier than ever weighted with the love of a man who'd chosen me when he didn't have to, who'd been more of a father in 7 years than Caleb had been in 17. Lucas found me there hours later, let himself in with the spare key I'd given him, and simply sat beside me in silence until I could breathe again. He was right, I finally said, my voice raw. About forgiveness, about all of it. I know he was. But I can't stop. Not yet. There's too much unfinished. Lucas put his arm around my shoulders and I leaned into him, this other father figure who'd appeared in my life bearing his own wounds from Caleb's betrayal. Maybe Sam was right, but I still can't stop. Evan appeared at my office 3 weeks after Sam's funeral, looking nothing like the confident baseball star I'd seen on television years ago. At 22, he'd developed the hunched posture of someone carrying weight they weren't built to bear, his eyes ringed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from weeks of crisis without relief. My assistant buzzed to tell me a young man claiming to be my brother was in the lobby, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I could have refused to see him. Should have, probably. But curiosity and something I didn't want to examine too closely made me tell her to send him up. He stood in my office doorway looking lost, holding a manila envelope that had seen better days. When he spoke, his voice cracked on the first word. Grace, I know you have no reason to help us. I know what they did to you was unforgivable. But Mom is dying. She stopped eating, stopped taking her medications. The doctors say it's a complete psychological breakdown. And Dad, he left. Just got in his car 3 days ago and disappeared. There are creditors calling the landlords, threatening eviction, and I don't know what to do. I gestured to the chair across from my desk, my face carefully neutral. Sit down, Evan. Tell me why you think I should care about any of this. He collapsed into the chair like a puppet with cut strings. Because despite everything, she's still our mother. Because she's suffering. Because I'm begging you. Ruth is not my mother, I said flatly. She made that clear when she helped abandon me to die in the cold. She couldn't love you the way she should have, Evan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I found out why. I was going through old documents looking for anything that might help with the creditors, and I found these. He opened the manila envelope with shaking hands and pulled out a sheaf of legal documents yellowed with age. Adoption papers, from when you were a baby. The world tilted slightly. I reached across the desk and took the papers, my eyes scanning the legal language until the relevant names jumped out at me. Sarah Allen, biological mother deceased. Ruth Allen, maternal aunt, legal guardian, and adoptive parent. I don't understand, I said, though understanding was already crystallizing in my mind like ice forming on glass. Mom had a younger sister named Sarah. Evan explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. She got pregnant, and according to these documents, the father wasn't named. Sarah died from complications shortly after you were born. Mom adopted you, raised you as her own, but she couldn't look at you without seeing her dead sister. She told Dad that once I found it in an old diary. She wrote, Every time I look at Grace's eyes, I see Sarah dying all over again. I know it's wrong. I know she's innocent. But I can't make my heart love what my mind knows it should. I stared at the adoption papers, at the careful signatures and official stamps that documented how I'd become Grace Allen. How I'd been born to one sister and raised by another who'd seen me as a living wound that wouldn't heal. So that's why it was easier for him, I said slowly. For Caleb to abandon me. Because I wasn't really his daughter. Just his wife's sister's unwanted child. He told me that once, Evan said, and shame colored his voice. When I was 14 and asked why he never talked about you, he said you weren't blood, so it didn't matter as much, and I believed him. God help me, I just accepted it. I looked at my brother, this young man who'd been raised with love I'd never received, who'd been cradled in the favoritism that comes from being wanted, and saw suddenly that he was as trapped as I'd been, just in a different cage. What do you want from me? I asked. Money. Enough to get Mom into proper psychiatric care and pay off the immediate debts. I'll work to pay you back, I swear. I'll sign anything due, anything. I pulled out a legal document I'd had drawn up weeks ago, anticipating something like this might come. Sign this. It transfers all remaining family assets to my name. The car, any bank accounts, any future inheritance rights. Everything. Evan read it with growing desperation in his eyes, the realization that he was signing away the last vestiges of the Allen family legacy visible in his expression. But he signed. What choice did he have? I'll arrange for your mother's care, I said, my voice empty of emotion. Private facility, good doctors. But I'm doing this for you, not for her. And not because of family, because we're not family. We're just people who survived the same household. He stood to leave the signed documents in my hands, everything he had left in the world now belonging to me. At the door, he turned back. You've won, he said quietly. You took everything from them just like they tried to take everything from you. But you know what? We're all children of the same sin. Their cruelty, your revenge, my cowardice. We're all broken by the same hands. After he left, I sat at my desk looking at the adoption papers, understanding finally why Ruth's eyes had always looked through me rather than at me. She hadn't seen her daughter. She'd seen her sister's ghost, wearing a face that was both beloved and unbearable. It didn't excuse what they'd done. It didn't make the gas station any less cold or the abandonment any less cruel. But it added a layer of tragedy to what I'd thought was simple evil, and that complication sat heavy in my chest. I didn't punish them. I just let justice do its work. The mansion sat at the highest point in the county, a modern architectural statement of glass and steel and old-growth timber that commanded views of the entire valley below. $5 million for 6,000 square feet of temperature-controlled perfection, floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the surrounding forest into living artwork automated systems that controlled everything from the lights to the window shades, with voice commands or phone apps. It was everything a successful 30-year-old investor should want: a monument to achievement visible from every corner of the town where I'd once been disposable. I signed the papers on a Tuesday in November, watching my signature transform me from Grace Walker apartment dweller into Grace Walker estate owner. The real estate agent couldn't stop talking about the smart home features, the heated bathroom floors, the wine cellar that could hold 500 bottles. I nodded and smiled, and thought about the gas station with its rusted pumps and broken windows, about how far I'd traveled from that night to this moment. The furniture I chose was expensive but minimal. A bed that cost more than my first car. A couch that seated 8 but usually held only me. In the great room with its cathedral ceilings and exposed beams, I installed a sound system that filled every corner with whatever music I chose, though I found myself playing the same song on repeat more often than I cared to admit. Silent Night, the tinny version that had played from my parents' car radio on the drive to my abandonment. The soaring orchestral arrangement I'd heard in the church where I'd received my scholarship. The simple piano melody Sam used to hum under his breath when he was teaching me to change my oil or balance a checkbook, his off-key voice somehow making the familiar carol sound like a lullaby. I hired an estate manager named Catherine, a retired military officer in her 50s who ran the property with efficient precision and asked no personal questions. She supervised the landscaping coordinated with the cleaning service, managed the security system that monitored every entrance and window. The house came with 2 German shepherds, trained guard dogs that had belonged to the previous owner, and Catherine assured me they were part of the property's comprehensive protection. "The dog system works perfectly, ma'am," she said. During our first week, a slight smile playing at her lips as she showed me the security panel. Digital observation and guard system integrated with the actual dogs. Both real and metaphorical protection. Nothing gets to this house without your permission. Something about the way she said it felt significant, though I couldn't have explained why. I just nodded and filed it away, another detail in the fortress I was building. My first Christmas in the mansion arrived with unseasonable warmth, but on Christmas Eve the temperature dropped and snow began to fall just after dark. I stood at the great room window watching flakes drift past the glass, thick and soft and relentless, accumulating on the deck and the trees and the stone pathway that wound down the hill toward town. I'd bought a single candle for the occasion, a simple white pillar that I placed on the windowsill. Its flame flickered in the slight draft from the heating vents, casting moving shadows across the polished wood floors. The house was silent, except for the piano version of Silent Night playing through the speakers, that melody that had haunted me for 8 years. Now that had become the soundtrack to both my destruction and my rebuilding. I thought about Sam, buried now in the church cemetery, his grave marked with a simple stone that read, "Samuel Porter, he saved more than he knew." I thought about Ruth in the psychiatric facility I was paying for, sedated and monitored and slowly coming back from whatever edge she'd walked to. I thought about Caleb, disappeared into whatever hole cowards crawl into when their crimes catch up with them. I thought about Evan working at the sporting goods store, living in a studio apartment, trying to build something from the rubble I'd left behind. Most of all, I thought about that 17-year-old girl in a gas station writing in her journal by firelight, documenting her potential death with numb fingers and a broken heart. She'd survived. She'd won. She'd built this glass fortress on a hill where she could see everything coming from miles away. So why did victory feel so much like solitude? The snow fell heavier, obscuring the view of town, turning the world outside my windows into nothing but white. The house was warm, perfectly climate-controlled at 72 degrees, but I pulled a blanket around my shoulders anyway and curled into the leather couch that seated 8. The piano played on. Silent Night. Holy Night. Sam's off-key humming overlaid in my memory. Ruth's trembling hands pouring cocoa. My father's forced smile before he drove away. All of it mixed together into something I couldn't quite name. Something that lived in my chest like an ache that wouldn't heal no matter how much money I made or how high I climbed. The candle burned lower. The snow kept falling. And somewhere in the warm, empty vastness of my $5 million mansion, I realized something that made my carefully constructed armor crack just slightly. I still hear the sound of tires rolling on snow. She appeared at my gate on a Thursday afternoon in late January, wrapped in a coat that had been expensive once, but now hung on her shrunken frame like borrowed clothing. Catherine called from the security system to tell me a woman claiming to be my mother was outside asking to speak with me. I could have said no, could have activated the cameras and watched her walk away, turned back into snow and memory. Instead, I heard myself say to let her in. Ruth had aged a decade in the year since the restaurant confrontation. Her hair had gone completely gray, thin enough that I could see her scalp in places, and her hands shook with a tremor that medication couldn't quite control. The psychiatric facility had stabilized her enough to function, but the woman who walked into my vast glass living room looked like she was held together by nothing more substantial than routine and prescribed chemicals. I didn't offer her a seat, just stood by the window overlooking the valley and waited for her to speak. My arms crossed my face, carefully neutral. Thank you for seeing me, she said, her voice as thin and fragile as the rest of her. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I would either. What do you want, Ruth? She flinched at the use of her first name instead of any maternal title, but didn't correct me. To tell you the truth. All of it. The parts you don't know yet. I know enough. You helped abandon me. You watched him drive away and did nothing. You chose your comfort over my life. I did, she said simply, and the lack of excuse or justification caught me off guard. And I've lived with that choice every single day since. But there's more to the story, Grace. Things Caleb never wanted you to know. Things I should have told you long ago. Against my better judgment, I gestured to the couch. We sat at opposite ends, an ocean of leather and unspoken history between us. Do you know why I left that church business card in your cocoa that night? Ruth's hands twisted together in her lap, the tremor making the movement jerky and uncontrolled. It wasn't an accident. I put it there deliberately. I prayed someone good would find you. Someone who would save you because I was too weak to do it myself. That's supposed to make it better. You condemned me to die but hoped someone else would clean up your conscience. No, nothing makes it better. She looked at me, then really looked at me, and I saw something in her clouded eyes I hadn't expected. Recognition. You have Sarah's eyes. My sister's eyes. Every time I looked at you, I saw her dying all over again. I know about the adoption, I said flatly. Evan showed me the papers. I know Sarah was my biological mother and that she died after giving birth to me. But you don't know everything. Ruth's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Sarah loved a man named Lucas Hartwell. They were engaged to be married. But Caleb wanted Lucas's business, wanted his connections and his money. So Caleb sabotaged them. Spread lies about Lucas, made Sarah believe he was unfaithful, destroyed their relationship systematically until Sarah broke off the engagement. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. Pieces of a puzzle I'd been assembling for years suddenly clicking into place with terrible clarity. Sarah was already pregnant when they separated, Ruth continued. She didn't know yet. By the time she realized, she was too proud to tell Lucas, too hurt to reach out. Caleb convinced her he could provide stability, could give the baby a good home. He married her 3 months later. He married her for the company connection, I said, understanding flooding through me. He wanted Lucas's business, and when he couldn't steal it through Sarah's marriage to Lucas, he stole Sarah instead. Yes. Ruth's hands twisted harder. Sarah knew. Realized too late what Caleb really was. The pregnancy was difficult, complicated. She knew she might not survive the birth. She wrote a letter, made me promise to give it to Lucas if anything happened to her. The letter said, if anything happens to me, give the child to Lucas. She's his daughter. He deserves to know. The room tilted. I gripped the arm of the couch, my knuckles white. But Caleb found the letter, Ruth went on relentlessly. He destroyed it, forced me to adopt you, forced me to keep the secret. He said if I ever told Lucas, he'd make sure I never saw Evan again, never saw you again. He controlled everything. The money, the house, every aspect of our lives. I was trapped. So you stayed silent, I said, my voice hollow. You let me grow up not knowing my real father was out there somewhere. You let me believe I was Caleb's daughter, that his cruelty was what I deserved. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Ruth said, and tears were streaming down her face, now silent and unstoppable. I know I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know the truth. Lucas Hartwell is your biological father. He doesn't know. Caleb made sure he never found out. And I was too much of a coward to tell him. I sat in silence watching this broken woman cry, processing information that rewrote my entire understanding of who I was. Lucas. The man who'd invested in my business. Who'd mentored me. Who'd taught me about forgiveness as strategy. My father. The birthmark he'd noticed. The way he'd looked at me sometimes with an expression I couldn't read. The photograph on his desk of him and Caleb taken before betrayal had drawn its lines. He'd been searching for his daughter without knowing she was standing right in front of him. But tears are not forgiveness. I was still processing Ruth's revelation about Lucas when my world collapsed for the second time in a week. My IT director called at 7 in the morning, his voice tight with controlled panic to tell me our client database had been accessed overnight from an unauthorized location. Financial records, strategic plans, proprietary algorithms we'd spent years developing, all copied to an external drive, then systematically deleted from our servers along with the backup logs. We had redundant systems, thank God, but recovering the data would take days. The damage assessment was worse. Whoever had stolen the information knew exactly what they were looking for and had covered their tracks with professional efficiency. My security team traced the breach to Evan's laptop, the one I'd given him 6 months ago when I'd hired him as a junior analyst in what I'd told myself was an act of mercy, but had probably just been guilt. I called him. The phone rang 8 times before going to voicemail. I called again. And again. On the 4th attempt, a text message came through. "I'm sorry. He said he'd kill himself if I didn't. I had no choice." My hands went cold. Caleb. Of course it was Caleb. Pulling strings from whatever hole he'd crawled into, using the son he'd molded into a weapon against the daughter he'd tried to erase. I was reviewing security footage, trying to determine how much damage control was possible when an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. Encrypted with a single line in the body, "Check your secure inbox. You'll want to see this. A friend." The secure inbox was something David and I had set up years ago during our consulting partnership, a paranoid precaution that had seemed excessive at the time. Inside was a detailed log of Evan's communications over the past week, including conversations with a competitor firm and, more damningly, with Caleb. Screenshots, phone records, everything I'd need to prove corporate espionage. 20 minutes later, David appeared at my office door without an appointment, looking like he'd been awake all night. "We need to talk," he said, and the expression on his face told me this was about more than just the data breach. He closed the door behind him and pulled a flash drive from his pocket. "Before you say anything, let me show you something. Something I should have shown you 8 years ago." The video was dated from my junior year of college, time-stamped 2 weeks before David had suddenly announced his engagement to Catherine Westbrook. It showed a younger Caleb still confident and imposing sitting across a cafe table from a younger David. The audio was clear enough to make out every word. "Your father owes my associate $160,000, Caleb was saying, his voice casual but his eyes cold. "Medical bills from your mother's treatment. The bank is ready to foreclose on your parents' house next month. Unless, of course, you'd like to discuss an alternative arrangement." David's younger face on the screen looked stricken. "What kind of arrangement?" "My business partner's daughter, Catherine Westbrook. Lovely girl, very interested in you. You marry her, and I'll personally see to it that your father's debt disappears and the foreclosure gets dismissed. You refuse, and I'll make sure every creditor he has comes calling at once. Your family will lose everything, and it will be your fault for being too selfish to help them." I watched my younger self's first love wrestle with an impossible choice, saw the moment he broke, saw him nod agreement with tears in his eyes. Then the video cut to another date, another location. David sitting in a church writing a check. The camera angle showed the amount $20,000, and the memo line, "Grace Allen Scholarship Fund Anonymous Donor." "I couldn't save us," David said quietly as the video ended. "I was 22 and terrified, and I took the coward's way out. But I made sure you could finish school. I sent money through the church every semester. It wasn't enough, I know that. But it was all I could do without Caleb finding out." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "All these years, you've been watching over me. All these years I've been trying to make up for abandoning you. When I saw your name on that conference list, saw Grace Walker and recognized you despite everything, I thought maybe I'd get a chance to explain, to apologize, to help however I could." He pulled out his phone. "Evan called me last night, broke down completely. Said he'd just done something terrible, that Caleb had manipulated him into stealing from you. He was terrified and guilty and didn't know who else to call. I told him to confess to you immediately, then I started gathering evidence. Why would he call you John? Because I've been mentoring him informally for the past year. After you hired him, he reached out, said he wanted to learn from someone who understood what it meant to come from a broken family. I saw myself in him, Grace. The same weakness, the same desperate need to please a father who didn't deserve it. I wanted to be angry. Wanted to rage at David for keeping secrets, at Evan for betraying me, at Caleb for continuing to poison everything he touched, even in exile. But sitting there looking at evidence of David's quiet devotion spanning 8 years, I felt something else entirely. Something that felt dangerously like hope, that not everyone who claimed to care was lying. I have enough evidence to destroy both Evan and the competitor firm, I said finally. I could bury them. You could, David agreed. Or you could show Evan what mercy looks like, what I should have shown you 8 years ago if I'd been braver. I thought about that while I made the necessary calls. To my lawyers, to the authorities, to Evan's public defender when he was arrested the next day for corporate espionage. I pressed charges because actions have consequences, but I also agreed to testify on his behalf at sentencing to explain the coercion and manipulation that had driven his choices. The letter he sent from jail was 3 pages long, handwritten raw with remorse. It started with, "I don't deserve your forgiveness," and ended with, "You were always the strong one. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that." I folded it carefully and placed it in the box with my old journal and Sam's letter. These artifacts of pain transformed slowly into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps understanding. The last time someone betrayed me, they vanished from the map. The ballroom of the Portland Grand Hotel held 500 people on Christmas Eve, every seat filled with donors, community leaders, and journalists who'd been promised an announcement about a major charitable initiative. I'd spared no expense on the event, the kind of gala that made people feel important just by being invited. Crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, a string quartet playing carols in the corner. White and gold decorations that caught the light and made everything look like it was dusted with snow. Ruth and Caleb sat in the 3rd row, positioned where the stage lights would illuminate them perfectly. Caleb had returned from wherever he'd been hiding, probably summoned by the promise of philanthropic involvement that might rehabilitate his ruined reputation. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit anymore, his face carrying the permanent tension of a man waiting for the next blow to fall. Ruth beside him looked medicated and fragile, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing. Lucas sat in the front row, David beside him. Both men knew what was coming, had helped me prepare for this moment, though neither had tried to talk me out of it. Some truths needed to be spoken aloud in front of witnesses, needed the weight of public acknowledgement to become real. I walked onto the stage as dessert was being cleared, my heels clicking against the polished wood. My red dress chosen specifically because it would photograph well against the white backdrop. The microphone was already live. My presentation loaded on the screen behind me, every detail controlled and planned with the precision I'd learned from 8 years of survival. "Good evening," I said, and 500 conversations stopped. "Thank you all for coming tonight. Before we discuss the charitable foundation I'm establishing, I want to tell you a story. A true story about a girl who was abandoned on Christmas Eve." I pressed the remote and the screen behind me lit up with a photograph I'd kept hidden for 8 years. Grace Allen at 17, taken for my shelter intake documentation. Hollow eyes, tangled hair, the kind of thin that comes from missing too many meals. The room went completely silent. This girl's name was Grace Allen. She was a straight-A student who worked part-time to help pay for school supplies. She took care of her sick grandmother. She believed her parents when they said they were taking her to see Christmas lights. I paused, letting the image sink in. Instead, they drove her to an abandoned gas station in sub-zero temperatures and left her there to die. I heard a gasp from somewhere in the audience, the rustle of people shifting in their seats. I didn't look at my parents. Not yet. I have her journal from that night. Would you like to hear what she wrote? I projected the page on the screen, my teenage handwriting visible in the firelight wavering script. Then I read it aloud, my voice steady and clear. December 24th, Christmas Eve. They left me at an abandoned gas station off Highway 26. I heard Dad say they wanted to teach me a lesson about gratitude. Mom cried but did nothing to stop it. The temperature is -5 Celsius. I don't know if anyone will find me. If I die here, let this journal be proof of what they did. The screen changed to show an official document, the police report from December 25th, and I read from it as well. Police report filed by Samuel Porter documenting the discovery of a 17-year-old female malnourished suffering from hypothermia and shock at an abandoned gas station. Subject stated, "Don't call the police to find my parents. They'll kill me again, just in a different way." Medical records next. Photographs from the shelter showing my frostbitten fingers, my too thin frame. Each piece of evidence, another nail, another truth that couldn't be denied or dismissed as teenage melodrama. "That girl didn't die," I said, and the screen changed one final time to show me as I was now standing in front of my mansion on the hill. She survived. She rebuilt herself. She became me. Grace Walker. Because Grace Allen had to die for me to live. I finally looked at my parents, then watched Caleb's face cycle through shock and calculation, watched Ruth begin to cry with silent shaking sobs that drew the attention of everyone around her. Cameras were already out, reporters recognizing the story of the decade sitting right in front of them. The charitable foundation I'm establishing tonight will support young people escaping abusive families. It will be called the Sam Porter Foundation, named for the man who saved my life and asked nothing in return. It will be funded entirely by my personal wealth built from nothing by a girl who refused to stay abandoned. The audience erupted into applause, people rising to their feet, though I could see the divide clearly. Some were moved by the story of resilience. Others were simply shocked by the spectacle. But all of them were looking at Caleb and Ruth Allen, now recognizing them from the old news stories about their missing daughter, understanding dawning in waves across the room. I walked off the stage down the center aisle, my head high. I had to pass directly by my parents' row. Ruth reached out as if to touch me, her hand trembling in the air between us, but I kept walking. Caleb sat frozen, his face ashen, trapped by 500 witnesses and nowhere left to run. Outside, the hotel had arranged a fireworks display for after the gala. They started as I reached the lobby, brilliant bursts of red and gold visible through the tall windows illuminating the falling snow. I smiled as I watched them collapse just as fireworks lit up the sky. I drove home alone through snow that had turned the highway into a tunnel of white, the mansion dark except for the automatic lights that sensed my approach and illuminated the long driveway like a runway. Catherine had left for the evening, the dogs were in their kennel, and the house waited with that particular emptiness that expensive things have when there's no one to appreciate them. The sound system activated when I entered motion sensors, triggering the playlist I'd programmed months ago. Silent Night piano version filled the great room with its familiar melody. I poured myself a glass of wine I didn't want and stood at the window overlooking the valley, watching the town below, its scattered lights like fallen stars against the darkness. My phone had been buzzing since I left the gala. Text messages, emails, calls from journalists wanting interviews from old acquaintances who'd suddenly remembered my existence now that I'd provided them with entertainment. I turned it off and set it on the counter, the silence that followed somehow louder than the notifications had been. The bathroom mirror was floor to ceiling, impossible to avoid, and when I finally looked at my reflection while removing the carefully applied makeup, I saw something that made me freeze. My mother's eyes looked back at me. Not Ruth's clouded, medication-dulled gaze, but the eyes from the photograph Lucas had shown me, once the picture of Sarah he'd kept all these years. The shape, the color, the way they held pain and tried to hide it behind performance. I'd spent so many years trying not to be like my parents that I hadn't noticed I'd become my mother anyway, the biological one I'd never known, carrying her hurt and her inability to escape it. I traced the birthmark on my wrist, the comma-shaped mark that had led Lucas to suspect, to test, to know. How long had he known? Had he realized the first time we met, or had it taken weeks of watching me studying my mannerisms before he'd been certain enough to obtain my DNA from a discarded coffee cup? And why hadn't he told me? The doorbell chimed just after midnight, the security screen showing Lucas standing in the falling snow, his silver hair dusted white, his expression unreadable. I buzzed him in without speaking, heard his footsteps echo through the empty house until he found me still standing at the window, still holding the untouched wine. "You did it," he said, not as congratulation, but as observation. "Exposed them publicly, destroyed what little reputation they had left. Your justice is complete." "Is it?" I turned to face him, this man who was my father, though neither of us had spoken the word aloud yet. "Because I don't feel victorious. I feel tired and empty, and like maybe I've just become another version of what I was trying to escape." Lucas moved to stand beside me at the window, both of us reflected in the glass against the darkness outside. "The question isn't whether your justice was deserved. It was. The question is what you do with your soul now. You've spent 8 years building toward this moment. What happens when the purpose that's driven you is fulfilled?" "I don't know." The admission felt like failure. "I thought I'd feel something. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction. Instead, I just feel hollow." "That's because revenge is a hunger that can't be satisfied. You feed it, and it just grows larger, demanding more." He was quiet for a moment, the piano still playing that eternal carol in the background. "I spent 30 years angry at Caleb for what he took from me. My company, my reputation, and Sarah. I thought if I could build something bigger, become more successful, prove he hadn't destroyed me, that would be enough. But it never was." "When did it stop?" I asked. "The anger." "It didn't. Not completely. But it changed the day I met you at that conference, saw the name Walker, and recognized Sarah's eyes looking back at me. I had my DNA test done within a week, confirmed what I'd suspected, and then I had to decide what to do with that information." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were building something, Grace, fighting your own battles, and I was afraid you'd reject me, afraid you wouldn't believe me, afraid that claiming you as my daughter would be just another form of control, another person trying to reshape your life to fit their needs." His voice broke slightly on the last words. "I thought being your mentor, helping you succeed, keeping you safe from a distance that would be enough. That I didn't deserve more after letting Sarah down so completely." I looked at this man who'd been my secret father for years, who'd guided me and invested in me and never asked for recognition. "You didn't let her down. Caleb destroyed you both. He's the one who kept you from knowing about me. I know that intellectually. But the heart doesn't always listen to reason." He touched his chest where I imagined his own pain lived. "What I'm trying to tell you is that revenge gave you power, but it won't give you peace. Only you can decide what that looks like." I thought about Ruth's visit, her confession, the truth about Sarah and the letter Caleb had destroyed. Thought about David's 8 years of quiet protection, Evan's broken apology from jail. Sam's final words about forgiveness being for my soul rather than theirs. All these threads of complicated humanity, people who'd failed and hurt and tried in their imperfect ways to make amends. Perhaps forgiveness is the most beautiful punishment. I murmured the words, surprising me even as I spoke them. Not forgetting, not excusing, but choosing to stop letting them have power over who I become. Lucas smiled slightly sadly. Perhaps forgiveness is the most perfect revenge. The year that followed the gala was one of reconstruction, though not in the way I'd expected. Lucas and I had begun the slow, careful process of becoming father and daughter, learning each other through weekly dinners and long conversations about Sarah, about the life that might have been if Caleb hadn't poisoned everything he touched. David had become something more than a business partner, but less than what we'd once been, a friendship built on understanding rather than romance. Evan had been released from prison after serving 8 months, his sentence reduced due to cooperation and the coercion evidence David had provided. I'd built the Sam Porter Foundation with methodical care, establishing scholarships and support systems for young people escaping abusive families, pouring money and attention into creating the safety net I'd needed at 17. The work was satisfying in ways revenge had never been. Each life changed, a small redemption for the girl I'd been. But I hadn't seen or spoken to Ruth or Caleb since the gala. They'd disappeared from public view, the scandal too complete for any rehabilitation. I'd heard through various channels that they'd lost the rented apartment, that Caleb's legal troubles had left them essentially homeless, that they were surviving on Ruth's disability payments and occasional charity. I told myself I didn't care. Mostly I believed it. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of heavy snowfall that transforms the world, the kind that had been falling 9 years ago when they'd driven away and left me to die. I'd spent the day alone by choice, turning down invitations from Lucas, from David, from the colleagues who'd become something like friends. The mansion was decorated minimally, just a small tree by the window, and the single white candle I lit every year in memory of that night, and the man who'd saved me from it. The intercom from the gate buzzer sounded at 7 in the evening, Catherine's voice coming through with unusual tension. "Ms. Walker, there are 2 people at the gate requesting entry. They say they're your parents, Ruth and Caleb Allen." My hand froze halfway to the wine glass I'd been reaching for. How did they find this address? "They said your brother gave it to them. Said he thought it was time for the family to reconcile." Evan, of course. He'd been to the mansion once since his release, apologizing again, trying to rebuild some kind of relationship with me. I'd been cautiously open to it, seeing in him someone who was genuinely trying to change. But this giving my parents my address, inviting them back into my life without warning, was a betrayal of a different kind. "Put them on the camera," I said. The security screen flickered to life, showing the gate at the bottom of my long driveway. 2 figures stood in the falling snow, backlit by the streetlight beyond the property. They looked ancient, shrunken by poverty and consequence. Caleb wore a coat too thin for the weather, his shoulders hunched against the cold. Ruth stood beside him, a cloth bag clutched to her chest, her breath visible in the frigid air. I turned up the audio feed and heard them speaking, their voices carrying across the distance. "Please," Ruth was saying to the camera, to me, to whoever might be listening. "We just want to see her. Just once. We won't ask for anything. We just want to say we're sorry." Caleb said nothing. Just stood there in the snow, and I realized with shock that he was crying. This man who'd orchestrated my abandonment, who'd destroyed Lucas and Sam, who'd manipulated his own son into corporate espionage, was standing at my gate in tears. They didn't try to force their way in. Didn't rage or demand or threaten. They simply knelt down in the snow, both of them, their hands clasped in supplication, and waited. I could see it all on the screen, could see them exactly as I must have looked 9 years ago, left in the cold, hoping someone would care enough to save them. The symmetry was almost poetic. The wheel had turned full circle, and now they were the ones begging for mercy from someone who had every right to deny it. Catherine appeared at my door, her expression carefully neutral. "What would you like me to do, ma'am?" I walked out onto the balcony, the cold air hitting me like a slap. From this height I could see the gate clearly, could see my parents kneeling in the snow just as they'd forced me to kneel years ago in that gas station through their abandonment. The floodlights that illuminated the driveway cast long shadows, turning the scene into something theatrical, staged. They must have sensed movement because they looked up, their faces tilted toward me, pale and desperate in the artificial light. Ruth raised one trembling hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or plea or simply acknowledgement that I was there, that I'd seen them, that they existed in my world again, even if only for this moment. The snow fell heavier, accumulating on their shoulders, on their hair, the same way it had accumulated on me 9 years ago, while I'd wondered if I would survive the night. I could leave them there, could let them freeze not to death, but to discomfort, let them feel just a fraction of what they'd inflicted on me. could demonstrate with perfect clarity that their choices had consequences, that karma was real and patient and thorough. Catherine stood beside me, awaiting orders, her hand near the control panel that operated the gate and the security system. Behind us, through the open door, Silent Night played on the sound system, that eternal carol that had marked both my destruction and my survival. The 2 German shepherds were in their kennel, trained and ready, part of the comprehensive security system that protected my fortress on the hill. The dog system, Catherine had called it, both real and metaphorical protection against anyone who might threaten what I'd built. Tonight, it's Christmas again. I stood on that balcony for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the cold seeping through my sweater, my breath visible in the air, watching 2 broken people kneel in the snow below. Inside the mansion, Silent Night continued its eternal loop, that melody that had become the soundtrack to every pivotal moment of my transformation. The holy night when I'd been abandoned. The holy night when Sam had found me. This holy night when everything came full circle. My fingers found the silver bracelet on my wrist, the one Sam had given me all those years ago, the word survive, engraved where only I could see it. I'd survived. More than survived. I'd built an empire from nothing, had exposed the truth, had claimed my place in a world that had tried to erase me. But survival wasn't the same as peace, and revenge wasn't the same as freedom. I thought about Sam's letter, his final words about forgiveness being for my soul rather than theirs. I thought about Lucas teaching me that strategy required knowing when to strike and when to let go. I thought about David's 8 years of quiet protection, about Evan's broken apology, about Ruth's confession that she'd left that church card hoping someone would save me. None of it excused what they'd done. None of it erased that gas station, or the hypothermia, or the scars that lived deeper than skin. But standing there watching them kneel in the snow, I realized something that felt like the final piece of understanding clicking into place. They were already destroyed. The people who'd abandoned me were gone, replaced by these hollowed-out shells who'd lost everything, including their capacity to hurt me further. The question wasn't whether they deserved mercy. The question was whether I deserved to finally be free of them. I turned to Catherine, my voice steady and clear. "Lock the gate. Release the dogs." She nodded once and moved to the control panel. The gate's security system activated with a series of mechanical clicks that echoed across the property floodlights, intensifying until the entire driveway was illuminated bright as day. The kennel doors opened and the 2 German shepherds emerged, powerful and purposeful, their training evident in every controlled movement. They ran toward the gate, barking loudly, not the vicious attack dogs of nightmares, but professionally trained guardians doing exactly what they'd been taught. They circled my parents, herding them away from the property with precision that was almost gentle despite the noise. Ruth stumbled backward, clutching that cloth bag to her chest, and I saw for the first time what she'd been holding. The security monitor zoomed automatically, showing me in detail what my eyes couldn't see from this distance. The bag was old, faded blue fabric with white flowers, and I recognized it with a jolt that felt like electricity. The same bag she'd used to wrap my Christmas presents when I was small, before everything had gone wrong, when I'd still believed that mothers loved their children unconditionally. Sticking out from the top was knitted fabric, deep green yarn worked in a pattern I remembered. A scarf she'd made for me when I was 12 that I'd worn until it was too small, that I'd thought was lost in the chaos of being abandoned. She'd kept it. All these years, through bankruptcy and breakdown and exile, she'd kept one piece of the daughter she'd failed to protect. The automated speaker system activated my pre-recorded message, playing across the property with neutral authority. "This is private property. Please leave immediately for your safety. The address of the nearest shelter is being provided." Catherine had already moved without being asked, her military efficiency evident as she sealed a manila envelope. Inside would be $500 in cash, and the address of the best shelter in the county, the one I'd donated to extensively. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but not death either. A middle ground that felt like the final boundary between who I'd almost become and who I chose to be. She slipped out a side entrance while the dogs continued their work, would leave the envelope on the ground, just outside the gate where they'd find it after the dogs herded them far enough away. I watched it all on the monitor, watched my parents retreat down the driveway toward the street, watched Ruth still clutching that bag with the scarf I'd thought was lost. Tears were streaming down my face, and I didn't bother to wipe them away. This wasn't weakness. It was release. The final severing of the chains I'd been carrying the weight of hate and hurt that had driven me for so long finally lifting because I chose to set it down. The gate locked with a final definitive click. The dogs completed their patrol and returned to the kennel. The lights dimmed to normal levels. Catherine came back inside, her face carefully neutral, and simply said, "It's done, ma'am," before leaving me alone on the balcony. I walked back inside, past the Christmas tree with its simple decorations, past the candle still burning by the window, back to the chair where I'd sat so many nights thinking about justice and revenge and all the ways I'd make them pay. I sat down and watched through the glass as snowflakes hit the warm surface and melted instantly, each one dissolving into nothing, each one proof that even the coldest things couldn't survive contact with something warmer. Silent Night played on peaceful and eternal, and for the first time since Sam had found me shivering in that gas station 9 years ago, I felt something very close to peace settle over me. Not because I'd forgiven them, not because I'd forgotten, but because I'd finally proven to myself that I was more than my pain, stronger than my anger, better than the cruelty that had tried to define me. The smile that crossed my face wasn't the cold satisfaction of revenge or the bitter triumph of seeing enemies fallen. It was simpler than that. Quieter. The smile of someone who'd finally, after everything, found their way home to themselves. I didn't forgive them, but I freed myself. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. Spring came 6 months after that Christmas night, transforming the cemetery where Sam was buried into something almost hopeful with its carpet of new grass and flowering trees. I'd been coming every week since his death, sometimes alone and sometimes with Lucas, bringing fresh flowers and sitting by the simple headstone that read, "Samuel Porter, he saved more than he knew." Today, Lucas stood beside me as I arranged white lilies in the ground vase, his hand resting gently on my shoulder in a gesture that had become familiar. Paternal, the physical manifestation of a relationship we were still learning how to name. "He would have been proud of you," Lucas said quietly, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in board meetings, but softened by genuine emotion. "Not just for what you built, but for how you ended it. That night at the gate." "I didn't end it," I said, standing and brushing dirt from my hands. "I just chose not to let it consume me anymore." "That's what I mean." He turned to face me, and I saw Sarah's eyes in his face the same way he must see them in mine, this genetic echo of a woman we'd both loved and lost. "I spent 30 years letting my anger at Caleb poison everything. Every business decision, every relationship, every moment of what should have been happiness. I let him steal my life twice, once when he took Sarah, and again when I let hatred replace the space she'd left behind. You did what I couldn't. You took your revenge without losing your humanity in the process." "I came close," I admitted. "There were moments I wanted to destroy them completely, to make them suffer the way I'd suffered. But you didn't. That's what matters." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "I know I wasn't there when you needed a father. I know I can never make up for the years Caleb stole from both of us. But watching you these past 2 years, getting to know you, seeing the woman you've become despite everything, that's been the greatest gift of my life." I took his hand, this man who was my father by blood and by choice, and let myself feel the weight of family that came without conditions, without manipulation, without the constant calculus of worthiness. "You're here now. That's enough." The support center opened 1 year after that night at the gate in a renovated building downtown that had once been a warehouse and was now bright with windows and warm colors and the kind of safety that comes from being truly seen. Sam's house. The sign read, and underneath, a place of hope and healing. The same words that had been on that church business card Ruth had left in my cocoa 9 years ago, the card that had somehow led to everything that followed. David had been instrumental in making it happen using his business connections and his own experience of being saved by anonymous generosity to create programming that went beyond just shelter. We offered counseling, education support, job training, and most importantly, the message that being abandoned didn't mean being worthless. We worked together easily. Now our romantic history transformed into something more durable, a partnership built on shared purpose rather than the desperate need we'd confused with love in college. Evan volunteered 3 days a week working with the teenage boys who came through our doors angry and scared and trying to figure out how to survive families that had failed them. Watching him with those kids, patient and honest about his own failures, I saw someone who'd taken his brokenness and alchemized it into empathy. We would never be close the way siblings raised with love might be, but we'd found a way to exist in each other's lives that felt like its own form of healing. That Christmas, my second in the mansion, an envelope arrived with no return address and postage from 3 towns over. Inside was a photograph slightly blurred as if taken by someone with unsteady hands. Ruth sat on a wooden bench in what I recognized as Riverside Community Church, the place where I'd received my scholarship, where Sam had volunteered, where my entire second life had begun. She looked older but more present somehow, her face thin, but her eyes clear in a way they hadn't been in years. In her hands she held a business card, faded and worn from being carried, and I knew, without being able to read it, which card it was. I turned the photograph over and found words written in shaking script. My daughter. I'm sorry. I made the wrong choice. Now I pray for you every day. I sat with that photograph for a long time, feeling things I couldn't name and probably wouldn't try. This wasn't reconciliation, wasn't forgiveness in any traditional sense, but it was acknowledgement, a closing of the circle that had begun 9 years ago with betrayal and had somehow impossibly led to this moment where I could read those words without rage or bitterness, just a quiet acceptance that some wounds scar over rather than heal completely. And that's okay too. I placed the photograph in the box with my old journal and Sam's letter. These artifacts of transformation, and went to light my annual candle by the window. The snow was falling again, but this time when I watched it accumulate, I didn't hear tires rolling away in the darkness. I just heard silence and peace, and the sound of my own breathing. Free, at last. And that's where Grace's story ends, or perhaps where it truly begins. She survived the unthinkable, rebuilt herself from nothing, and discovered that the greatest revenge isn't destruction, but freedom. Freedom from hatred, freedom from the past, freedom to choose mercy not because they deserved it, but because she deserved peace. Some of you watching might be thinking Grace should have done more, should have made them suffer longer. Others might believe she showed too much cruelty, that forgiveness should have come sooner. And that's exactly what makes this story so powerful. There's no simple answer when it comes to betrayal. This deep wounds, this profound. Grace didn't forgive her parents in the traditional sense. She didn't welcome them back into her life with open arms. But she also didn't let hatred consume her soul. She found that narrow path between justice and vengeance, between accountability and cruelty, and she walked it on her own terms. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Grace made the right choice that final Christmas night? Should she have let them into her home, given them a real second chance? Or should she have been even harsher, letting them face the full consequences without any mercy at all? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely curious where you stand on this. Was this justice, or was it revenge? Can you have both? And here's another question. If you were in Grace's position, what would you have done differently? If you made it this far, you're clearly invested in stories about resilience, justice, and the complicated nature of family. This channel is dedicated to bringing you these kinds of powerful, emotionally charged true stories that make you think, make you feel, and maybe even make you see your own life differently. If you enjoyed Grace's journey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. We've got dozens more coming, tales of betrayal and redemption of people who refused to stay broken of justice, served cold and hearts that learned to heal. Your support means everything and helps us keep bringing these stories to life. Thank you for watching, for caring, and for being part of this community. Until next time, remember, survival is just the beginning. What you build after surviving, that's what defines you.